You're doing well, Mr. Ebert. Your piece on metaphysics you released on Substack was outstanding.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I never know what to do. Um, Let me put my thing here. I'm making some spaghetti, but I never know what to do. What do you do? Like this issue of communicating to the layperson, because effectively, the reasons for committing to communicating to the layperson. I don't even know if I can think of any reasons that are not market driven. Unless I'm talking about my daughter, I'm trying to explain something to my daughter. But the whole like, hey man, say it so the people in back can hear. And so I have to reconfigure all the language, take all of the nomenclature, which I've spent years and years unpacking, learning, mastering, and that each little word of nomenclature itself is already a lossless compression of information that carries with it, just terabytes of data in a single word. And you want me to, instead of using that word like entropy, you want me to have to fucking explain entropy in normal language on my Substack? You want me to, how much time do you think I have? Like, why is it incumbent upon me to speak to the dearth of language in you? Why is it not incumbent upon you to increase your access to language? One comment was, why don't you speak in a language that more of us can access? And I said, why don't you why don't you attempt to learn to access more language? Anyway, so I don't know, I just don't know, man. I don't know. That's What am I doing? What is my Substack? What am I doing? Who am I speaking to? Is it all about the broad audience? Literally, the guy was like, I mean, the message basically is that every death is a new life. I'm like, yeah, but every self-help guru out there is already saying that. That's not what I'm trying to speak to a cosmogenetic, sort of cyclical, universal, quasi-scientific, metaphysical proposal, and you want me to turn into a life coach so that I can what? I don't even know it. Grow my audience. You know what I thought of today? Substack, subscription stacking. I realized that's the name. I was like, oh my God, fuck. Anyway, that's where I'm at.
Well, first off, thank you for all of that. Magnificent. And Michelle made a homemade tomato sauce yesterday out of some of the canned tomatoes he did. It was tremendous. So it's spaghetti is great. Sam, Clayton, Jock, and Javier, wonderful to see all of you. So been coming up, and the great Sam Willem, good to see you. So on all it. So first off, no one, the first thing to come to mind is no one has to understand anything. One can always take a position of, I didn't get it, therefore it is your fault, right? Kind of holding up a certain kind of like box, and you're supposed to fill it, and if you didn't fill it, it is your fault, in different things, right? And one of the problems is, and this makes me just think of culture too, if you have a culture that accepts the move of the reader to say, I didn't get it, therefore it's the author's fault, there's kind of a failure of culture there, because really, I think, dare I say, there should be an idea of you, if you did not get it, then maybe you need to rise up to the language, right? As opposed to be in a posture of not getting it. If we're talking about ideas of limit and saturation and people say, I don't understand it, well, then, of course, there's always a question of, well, what other way could you put it, right? And I think also, I guess just as some opening thoughts with it, I think about that too. But there's some things when you can genuinely look at the work and you can genuinely say to yourself, this communicates what I'm trying to communicate. There's value to it. And if people don't understand it, well, that's okay. And I really could not have done more. Well, then that's that, right? I think it's an extremely, it's like Javier and Jock and I, we did that philosophy book called A Philosophy of Glimpses. It's like 70 pages where, you've done a piece where, no, it isn't like the conflict of mind, reconstructing AA or getting into a lot of more complicated things. But I don't think it betrays any of the deeper ideas, even if all of the sections in that book could be elaborated on. right? And if somebody is interested in those sections and they want to go deeper, great. But if they read that book and say, I still don't get it, well, you've made an effort. You've done something to try to at least bring things together in a more consolidated way, and that's all you can do. And I think actually, honestly, the vulnerability to that claim is necessary to have in order, honestly, in my opinion, to write anything that's going to have any substance or any value, right? You have to be willing to be vulnerable to that critique. And that's something I appreciate about the work you're doing, because obviously a lot of people are like, oh, we don't get it, and yet you're still putting it out. But I think that willingness to take those critiques is actually really, really important. Because if you avoid them forever, what you end up doing is basically just training the audience or people to never rise themselves to the occasion of the language or to rise themselves to the occasion of a higher work. And therefore, they never have to move outside of themselves, which is then training them into a disservice that then they also lack the capacity to know is a disservice because they've never seen beyond it. Which makes me think about the limitations that the whole piece is, that the piece brings out, right? There's something in the piece that's actually suggesting this very sort of issue, right? This kind of betweenness there. So those are some opening thoughts I have. Mr. Ebert, please.
Yeah, mind if I just rant because it's so
Please.
fresh on my mind. So you read? Did you read the piece? Did you
Oh,
see
yes,
it?
absolutely.
I tried to incorporate, for instance, a cheeseburger and a Cheshire cat,
Yeah.
right? You have these two objects, and they're very cutesy objects, and you can relate to them. And if they both occupy the same space, they're no longer differentiated objects. They're a I don't know what I came up with, like a cheese, a cat burger or whatever. The thing that I'm having trouble with, by the way, even though I did that and I extended these stupid ideas. Like I made these really concise, beautiful remarks, dumb on purpose, so that more people could understand them, and diluted the potency of the ideas in their scientific potency. I diluted them so that I can introduce a Cheshire fucking cat and a cheeseburger to ideas that really don't need that involved, right? But I'm trying to drag you along, like, okay, here you learn. I still get comments. There's a guy who wrote me, I almost want to read it verbatim. I am from Greece. You should write in such a way that I understand. Only the simplest words are the real ones. Now, I have heard this fucking sentiment ever since Hemingway introduced them, and I cannot fucking stand it. And I've got and since in the last 48 hours, I've been getting in these arguments with people. My argument is basically this: if we're all, this is a homogenization of language issue. Simplicity, first of all, is driven by market concerns. Like I'm hundy p on that. Number two, the thing you brought up: if we don't learn something, or sorry, if we don't immediately comprehend something, that means there's something there to be learned. If we immediately comprehend it, I'm not so sure anything was gained, right? Now, nevertheless, people want something immediately gained. So I think there may be a ratio between the extent to which you are confused and the extent to which there is potential learning to be gained, a potential education, and the extent to which you are not confused and the diminishment of that potential education. So let's just say I understand all the words. You just said something profound, but it was in words that I completely already understood. Maybe the arrangement was new, and I'm like, what a pithy new way to think about X, Y, and Z. It opens up something. Fair enough, great. But I find that the more difficult the material, the more I'm incensed, not only incentivized, but angered, but incensed in a good way, like incentivized and angered to learn what the fuck this is about. And that's when the sort of delta between ignorance and knowledge like really widens, and I take that leap and I become exponentially more educated about a given thing because I was so ignorant about that thing. And that happens all the time to me. It's one of the reasons that I love, I don't know, philosophy in general, I guess. But I guess my question, it's like know your audience. I don't want to I don't want to think about, I don't want to have audience capture. I don't want to be audience captured to the masses, nor to the niche scientists and metaphysicists and so on. metaphysicians. But I am starting to just like wonder, like, did I dilute that paper? Would it have been more ultimate service? Not in the near term. In the near term, of course, I'm going to feel like no one cared, no one read it because it was so opaque. But in the long term, usually it's the opaque, like, texts that have that lasting power that end up being these sort of like sage tomes. Anyway, I thought that what I wrote was a really important contribution to metaphysics generally. And yet I diluted it down so that if anyone in the future is to read it, they're going to, like, if I was to read that and I start seeing Cheshire Cat and Cheeseburger, I'm already going to know this dumb author is like trying to appeal to dumb people. And I'm not dumb. And I don't know if I should be reading this. So I'm just so confused as to what the fuck to do. Do you know what I mean?
It is a tricky thing. Now, first off, Hegel's talking about cows being black at night. So, talking about cheeseburgers and cats does not disqualify you. And no, well, I was just reviewing, and I'll give it to Javier and Jockin. I appreciate everything you're saying because I think these are real tensions I think about, and I think that are very pressing for writing and thinking and all of that. I was just reading kind of Paul Ricoeur, and his idea is basically phenomenology and hermeneutics are always tied together. Like in all phenomenology is a theory of reading, because reading and interpretation are actually very close together. And what basically it's also suggesting is that the highest form of education is actually teaching people to read. Now you go, okay, Dan, but no, what Paul Ricoeur means is something different than simply learning how to decipher marks on a piece of paper. It's the mode of engagement with a text is what he's really interested in. And in fact, one of the examples that basically come up is people's relationship to hard books. And what he wants to say is that if when you experience, say, the difficulty in literature and your immediate reaction is to say, this is bad, it's not merely a taste thing. It's actually closing down your capacity to experience reality, even beyond the text, because what you're doing is training yourself into a habit of a certain assumption of what that emotion means that then you carry to all of life. And so he's really interested, because he does a lot in literature and different things, on actually catching people's phenomenology, of reading and really focusing and training that, because he's very concerned that if you do not do that, ultimately all hermeneutics will end up in what he famously calls a hermeneutic of suspicion. Now, a lot of people have heard that phrase from Paul Ricoeur, but it's actually quite important how he arrives at it. It arrives at being, it's the ultimate result of a people whose response to difficult things is to say they're bad, right? Because eventually that leads to a sort of, well, I need to take a better step and actually develop deconstructive capacities where not only is that thing bad, it's disqualified so it can't threaten me anymore, actually, and unveil something about my incompetence. So he sees this kind of knee-jerk reaction against difficult texts as ultimately leading to the hermeneutic of suspicion that then is actually going to really destroy, in his opinion, creative works and intellectual development, because people, if they experience great work, their first reaction will be to tear it down. And so he thinks that's going to lead to actually just a complete retraction of development in general in terms of philosophy and the arts. And he's writing in the 50s and 60s and 70s and these things. And I think he died 2005. He lived a pretty long time, maybe born in the 40s or something. But that this would actually have consequences in politics and all of that, because he's also thinking the world wars and different things. So it's very interesting you bring it up. And I think Paul Ricoeur is very interesting. For me, there's a few tensions here. First off, if you write something where you feel like that there's more to be said, well, there's also something where if you give everyone is that tension between the saturation that you talk about, right? If you overwhelm people, they may not get it. But if you underwhelm them, then that also may not pull them in. But there's also something to be said where if you, if one is offering where they can listen to your lectures or they can read other books and find more elaboration on what is presented in that small piece, it's clear then that you're not, it's more like the small piece or the simplified piece is the tip of an iceberg, right? It's not where you're sacrificing anything. It's where you're showing a tip of an iceberg that if people want to go deeper, they can. So I think about that. I think about writing many things kind of in relationship to kind of feed off one another. I also do, I guess, work on my own internal judgment of did this did this sacrifice complexity or did it shave off nuance that nevertheless points toward that nuance or that depth if they want to go there, right? Like, because I think there's a difference between sacrificing depth and leaving out depth in such a way that people can sense that there's something more, right? That's one way I also think about it, where I'm trying to simplify it in some works in such a way that nevertheless creates the impression that there's more there that can be investigated. But it's attention. I'll give it to Javier and Jockin because I think this also applies to many different areas in life. On when you're talking to people, how much do you leave out? You know, I think we do unfortunately have the tyranny of put it in the language of a third grader. It's a kind of tyranny that make it simple, right? And actually, that tyranny, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because if everyone makes it where a third grader can understand it, then everyone becomes a third grader, actually. That is actually, it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling feedback loop that I think comes in. I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. Anything else before I pass it?
Very
Yeah.
quick. I just agreed with everything you're saying. The tyranny of the third grader. The thing that's especially vexing about that is that it has been transposed. That tyranny has been transposed onto the knowledge bearer, such that wisdom is now conflated with simplicity,
Yes.
and it's the most tedious. Anyway, there is a solution that I've been playing with. I just didn't do it on that last post because it is tedious, but I'm doing it on an upcoming post where I sort of segment my pieces. I'm like, okay, guys, this is bunny slopes. Okay, guys, after this little line here, this little divider, this is very difficult stuff. Please don't read it if you're, you know, like if you're not like if you don't think you can, like, check it out, look over the edge. But if it seems too steep, don't go down it, because I don't want to fucking hear your bullshit about how you need a helicopter rescue in the middle of a paragraph. Do you know what I mean? Enter at your own risk. And I think that there's something good about that, because it actually creates a bit of a barred absolute that is like an opacity that might trigger a curiosity that might not otherwise be there, and might be like, oh, actually, he's telling me not to go, so I want to go, and so on. So we'll see how that plays out.
Enter at your own risk is a lovely phrase. Maybe that's what you open. I really like that. And Sam's comment also of putting stuff in footnotes. I do that all the time. Yeah, exactly. Where you put kind of some of the details or the number later. That could be nice. But then there are also works. You know, sometimes with belonging again, there's also it's like, well, there's a lot here because the case is elaborate. And then maybe when you get to belonging again, part 4, which I might also call zero. So it's supposed to be an explanation, an address, a life, and a summation. And the idea of a summation is that you could basically read that and not read anything else. But if there's anything in the summation that you're like, I don't get, well, then here, check out 2.3, right? That's, I guess, a model that I've done with belonging. And that's the plan. Whether I make it or not before I die or something, we'll see. But, you know, explanation, address, life, that would be essays on like different things. And then a summation that is also supposed to be where part 4 is also part 0, where you could theoretically read that and not the other thing. So there are different designs that I think about.
Yeah,
But please.
the footnote thing is a good point. I don't know if anybody here has read Sadly Porn by Edward Teach,
I have
or even
not.
look through it. It's a book where every single page is maybe a quarter or a fifth or a sixth or a seventh of it is text. Every page, the rest of it is all footnote. And it's a comic sort of joke, but most of the book is footnotes, precisely for that reason. It's like, here's like the layman thing, but here's what I'm actually trying to say, and so on. So that is possible. Unfortunately, on Substack, you can't really quite do it that way. You can't do a page by page notation, and so when you read the footnotes, you have to like, you're kind of lost. You know what I mean? They're just sort of floating in space. Anyway.
Not, I'm thinking David Foster Wallace now, obviously, famously text notes and different things like that. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera and then Mr. Jockin. Mr. Rivera, good to have you, sir.
Yeah, this is a problem. This is a problem. Um, so I've been going back to poetry again, and there's something very symptomatic about what Ebert is pointing out, because it's not just like philosophy, right? It's not just it definitely has to do with knowledge, but it definitely has to do with the fact of the I would say people it's not even like just the fact that we don't understand. It's the fact that we can't bear that we don't understand. Like we can't bear it. But then when you look at poetry these days, you read people like Rupi Kaur, for example. I'm just going to give you an example right here. You read Rupi Kaur, for example, and it's like so simple. It's so simple. And then you're like, well, wait a second. Why is it so simple and why is it so popular? From a woman, and she was interviewed. This was like a long time ago when I read this article, which I don't know if she's changed her methods, but like she admitted to not reading poetry, and writing something so simple. And I'm like, why do people love this? And it's because, well, it shows either a couple of things. Either people are so articulately deprived, like they can't even articulate simple thoughts themselves, that they love poetry like this. And so in that sense, Rupi Kaur actually serves like a pivotal role about why this certain form of poetry like starts propping up. Like to me, I don't just accept like the fact that it's like bad poetry or something. Like it's like metaphysically symptomatic of like what is actually happening with the world right now. Because if poetry has been reduced to this insta poetry simplicity, it means that even people themselves cannot articulate general feelings about what they're feeling. And all they can say about what's good poetry is that they resonate with what is being articulated. So this is such a huge problem. Like, should the poet be the one that is only articulating what you already feel versus showing you possibilities of feeling and possibilities of approaching thinking and looking at the world? So I've noticed that there's I don't think it's a coincidence that when people don't love poetry, it's also because they can't stand things that they don't understand. Um, but then even when you read people like Billy Collins, for example, I'm a really big admirer of the everyday type of poetry. Like I love that shit. Like Bukowski, Billy Collins, all these guys that like just write about the everyday because it's simple. But then but like think about it though, like actually craft the simpleness of your everyday life without it being like I pick up this cup, uh, I go to work. It's like, no, there's got to be something defamiliarizing in you depicting the everyday in which you don't even fucking realize that is amazing. So there's something in which you're writing simple poetry and yet you're supposed to stumble upon that thing of like you're fighting with your girlfriend and then you're like then all of a sudden you stop and you're looking at rabbits out the porch window. Like that's fucking poetic, but it's like what the fuck? Like why was that the thing that like got you guys, like looking at bunnies out the window. Like it's it's insane, but also at the same time it just shows you even crafting simplicity is an art, but also at the same time like not the point. The point of crafting simplicity, at least from a poetic standpoint, is to reveal to you the depth in which simplicity lives. And so to make it simple is really like what Ebert's pointing at, is to say, I want it flat so I can understand it. I want it completely flat. Because I'm afraid if I don't understand it, then I can't bear it. And Billy Collins saying like the big mistake schools made with poetry was us trying to whip meaning out of them, you know? And there's a sense in which we should try to discover the meaning. Yes, that's true. But I think poetry was one of those things where it's like before we even approached philosophy, it was one of those avenues in which you could just read it and just go about your day without trying to whip the meaning out of it. and it could affect you and it could grow on you. Um, and it's like philosophy can have that same effect, but it's like you have to bear it. You have to be able to bear that you don't understand and don't know. Um, but perhaps poetry is that service, that maiden of service to help you even bear the thing that you can't understand before you tell someone like Ebert that you should make it in simple words. But just as an antidote to why simplicity always fails, is there's always a gap in simplicity, because I work at an urgent care and my girlfriend is a x-ray tech, and we always try to recorrect how we say things to people, right? To avoid the most amount of error. But here's a funny thing that happens. So she's x-raying this patient and she's like, all right, so you don't have to take off your bra. You just have to like drop it, like you don't have to take it all the way off. You just have to drop it below like your knee, like your waist, right? But the lady takes everything off. Okay. She takes everything off. So she's just like tits out everything. My girlfriend's like, that's not what I mean. Like just like you can put your shirt back on, you can leave the bra off, that's fine. So the lady literally puts the shirt around her neck. And that was the definition of putting the shirt on. And I just started laughing because I was like, well, technically, like, she's not wrong. Like, the shirt is on, like, just not covering. So it just shows, like, no matter how many times I've tried to, like, I'm like, this is a sure-proof way of, like, nobody's going to misunderstand. No one's going to give me grief about it. There's always one person that's like, I have to rethink everything about what the fuck I just said. There's always one person that's like, I never expected that misunderstanding. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, magnificent. As a quick comment, then I'll give it to Jockin, Sam, and Ebert. So there's two things. It's very interesting. I'm glad you brought up what you were saying on this technical problem, because in my impression is we're in a society where there's this radical oscillation between keep it simple or this radical technical every detail language, right? Kind of the lawyer or the very simple. And one wonders if there is any overlap between these things. And in some respects, both of them are, you don't have to think. Because if I list down all the technical details and all you have to do is follow every step, you don't need to think, you just need to follow, right? Whereas if it's super simple, that's also an invitation not to think. So there's, I think, a reaction against anything that invites thinking. So we either want super simple prose or we want superly technical, complex prose, because both of them removes us from the reading process. And Christian, good to see you, sir. And the reason I say this is because there's something about a knee-jerk against opportunities, I almost want to say, for apprehension and maybe noose, which I know we've been speaking about. Because when you read something you don't get, precisely this inability to get it in terms of maybe immediate understanding is an opportunity for apprehension or going deeper into the apprehension of something there, right? But that means you're participating in the work, and it's scary to participate in it, and we don't actually trust any sort of intellectual activity that isn't in our immediacy. We've been trained out of it, which, if we can connect this to what we've been talking about, the apprehension or the noose, is meaning that in our reading habits, we're trained out of life or the ability to live or the actually to explore deeper thought. I think also it makes me think of the difference between how people react to unknown. When you tell me that mountain's unknown, do you get scared or say adventure, right? We tend to exist in a society where we see something unknown as scary, or we say it's unknowable. Therefore, I don't have to think. But we're removing thinking. And I know Cadell and Davoud Gosley have spoken about this. We're in a society using data or using ideas or using simplicity to remove thinking. But there's some sort of knee-jerk then against opportunities of noose. And I should also note, there always has traditionally been an idea of the muse or maybe the genius. And often we hear that and say, oh, well, that's problematic because there's a certain individualism in that. That could be bad. But actually, a plus side of that is if you read, say, Dostoevsky or Shakespeare and you didn't get it, well, he's a genius, so you better just shut up and figure it out, right? Like, there's also something about genius and the muse that had a way of signaling to the audience the posture, right? Because, okay, you may not get Milton, you may not get Dante, but if, there was a muse that gifted it, then you need to sit with it, right? Now, that could be taken too far and could be used as a power play. But in removing that, perhaps for good reasons, there's now a certain problem of incentivizing the audience to do hard things and incentivizing readers, which then, of course, if you don't do that, you may end up having knee-jerks against noose and apprehension. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Well, I'm thankful you brought up my most recent article from Substack, following on Substack, because it actually leads to a couple of major parts. I mean, I jumped in middle of Alex's very strong statements. I enjoyed the energy immensely. It is not the first time that I've also experienced this problem of, I call it the legibility problem. We want things smooth. We want removal of friction. Don't make me think. Let's not process things. Want to be digestible. So I'm thinking about this kind of mode of speed. Basically, we want the communication to happen with a very high, rapid exchange speed. And that usually requires compression of the information and to the most normed, simple things. I think that's actually part of the most frustrating thing about it. It's actually rather ironic that I think like Javier is just like kind of norming poetry, that you're seeing the kind that's kind of being digestible now by algorithms. There's like multiple aspects of this, because one is the anthenemy kind of rhetorical perspective is that there's all these unspoken parameters that people are using. They kind of summarize what my article is saying is that when we actually do philosophy properly, we should get this alien wonder of realization of things we took for granted or actually not as they seem. There's actually a whole deeper reality behind it. And what we thought we knew, we actually don't know. That the givens that we worked with were actually operating with preconditioned dependence. So I think an example of that is the kind of algorithms that operating on us and are basically compelling us. It's kind of min-maxing certain parameters that are rewarding certain behaviors and not rewarding certain behaviors. It's rather ironic that we think we're in a society and culture of pure freedom, that we get to do whatever we want with all our such activities. But yet, ironically, these algorithms do set patterns of what is rewarded. We get more of that. What you don't get rewarded. And yourself gets pushed. Yourself gets pushed if you're rewarded, if you're in the right parameters and compression of information. And that goes in any platform, I think, audience or platform they're operating on. I think fundamentally, though, I think at the core of the matter, there's two issues. One is, what's the purpose of writing? I think this was another aspect just I want to reflect on. Because there was an article I read, there's an essay, a lecture I read once, very good on this topic. I do think I do subscribe to this. There are different kinds of writing. There is the kind of writing meant for us, that we deal with such complicated thinking that we need to write it down just to process everything we're thinking about. That is different from the kind of writing meant for someone else to engage with. And in its most pessimistic point of view, to be consumed. But in a more optimistic point of view, and actually I think, Daniel, your note about how to read, I think is very fair to say this part, is it's a transformation of someone's life. That via an experience of reading, whether it be poetry, a piece of a philosophy of text, there's supposed to be a new transformation that occurred from the experience, right? That's actually really hard. That's incredibly hard. And it's very much a skill set. And actually, Alex, I didn't get to read your article. I just quickly skimmed it because I want to know what you meant by this cheeseburger and pass me your cat kind of thing. That's a common example where the examples you're using are cross-wiring. It's just no one's getting it because of the fact that the examples were being used. And it's funny, and it's very much an audience-dependent thing because, for example, I quickly skimmed it. Your note about absence and presence. As someone who's a proponent of lack, I'm like, of course. But that's the thing. I already have this I've already done that work. I'm not we can have a conversation, for example, because all this work of this kind of quality of present absence is something I already agreed to and bought into. I see the significance of that. As I said before, that lack is not nothing, and there's a kind of something that was a given I realized was not a given. I think that's important because there's just an issue. It's like issues of the same content can have completely different impact based on your audience and what kind of writing you're doing. Because there is sometimes writing I do that's meant for me, that it just happens to be in a public format. And then there's writing meant for others. And it's more synthesized. But I think it's an important area just to be aware of. It's an understandable frustration. I've had that before in the past. But I think it's one of the ways I've just addressed that issue, is that there's different kinds of writing and purposes of it. But I think another aspect of this issue of compression is we actually forgot the concept of concision. Concision can sometimes be compressed to be just simplicity. That's not exactly what that means. Concision is this penetrative, multiple things said at the same time. It's actually a very powerful quality. The Quran has many aspects of this. Really powerful poetry has this. Kind of what Javier is kind of getting at, is that it's a very simple statement, very simple things said in a right context, and then with kind of overlapping of relationships, can basically say multiple things at the same time. In design, we do this all the time. Any kind of like gestalt aspect where we're getting multiple images, aka the FedEx logo, the arrow showing up is one example. That's concision. It's ironic that that gets presented as simplicity, but ironically, it's actually complexity. It's actually very complex, very intentional complexity in a very specific arrangement that basically in the same one moment, you get multiple things at the same time. And as Daniel's used many times that logo to talk about the idea of a present, literally something that you don't even recognize, that's present there the whole time, that was not recognized, and then it becomes recognized at a certain state of observation. Or what you said, Dan, about how to read, I call it, it's a logos, it's an account. You see reality by your accounts. And when you have a different logi, you have the different logi give you different perspectives of reality. And if you have a training in visual arts, you would see the figure ground relationship dynamics we could solve. That gave you things like the FedEx logo or other things like that. And that simplicity for wisdom is, I think, a misunderstanding of that point. The same as of wisdom, absolutely have concision. I would probably make that statement, but that doesn't mean simplicity in the normal sense of this compression, the smoothing out, the lack of friction. I think that's an important detail. I also, just by the way, there's note of footnoting other styles. I don't know if anyone else has read House of Leaves. I think that's kind of a par excellence of this idea. Both by, it uses marginalia techniques, it uses typesetting techniques, it's using footnoting techniques. It's very much an object of experience of multiple points of view. I think it's just a note that came to my mind. I think also Javier shared about this error stuff. I keep constantly thinking of this meme. I'm going to post it in the chat of this, of like, it's a video of a woman. It's like, to summarize the meme, it's a person putting blocks into a bucket that's predefined with holes. And so it has an intentional, it's supposed to be like, an arch and a circle and a long rectangle. And it's supposed to put the block in the assigned hole. That's the purpose. But of course, that's the lateral position of it. If you rotate it, lengthwise, ironically, all the blocks can fit into the square hole. And no one designed for that. No one planned for that. And then actually the meme I'm going to share, it's really hilarious. It's a woman, like a nurse. It's a kind of a nursery, kind of context woman you would expect, like talking with a child, to say, which one hole does this go in? And then she gets like more and more upset when it gets shown that they're all going into the same hole. It's all going to the square hole, not into the intentional arch hole, rectangle hole, etc. And she gets more and more upset over the course of it. I'm just thinking about that just again. Like, I think these kind of, the whole idea of compression, smoothing out, simplicity, removal of friction, it's all to try to avoid that. And trust me, I've been in education. Let me tell you something, 100%, we have a optimization technique to try to get rid of those kind of surprise moments. We want to get rid of it. We're like, no, it failed. We failed because someone did an unexpected interaction. I just want to point that out. It's like we don't even have a mental conception to hold surprise of like, oh, right, someone, instead of being a positive thing, someone thought unexpectedly. That was like, oh, no, we failed. Because we didn't account for this basically almost an escape velocity of a possibility of the human, which is also, there's a larger part here. It's like the humans being compressed out, that we can be just a bunch of automaton NPCs, as I say in the article, my Substack article about that. Like, thought has just been, we don't realize how much actually thought is very rare, because most of us are operating really on imagination, estimated power, and projectional social images that we are just basically trying to get min-max our way to pleasure. That's actually most of the human experience. Thought is actually, if you really think through what thought is, it's a much rarer experience, very rare. And that's what the art is supposed to give us, this kind of strikes. this kind of development and process. So very, very fun article, fun discussion. That's all for me.
No, magnificent, and I'll give it to Sam and Ebert. And a few things come to mind. And I think this conversation also points to some reasons why perhaps philosophy has been waning or in decline. And the reason I say that, but first, Rita Dove had that lovely line where he said, basically when a word dies, so is lost also a capacity to experience the world. And her point is that it really matters if you can use language, because if you lose language, that really affects your ability to experience. Like if the words cerulean, azure, blue are all just similes to you, that you don't deeply sense the different shades of blue that each of those mean. Her argument is that basically it becomes more difficult to literally experience those differences of blue, right? So if we take that seriously, and I think Paul Ricoeur, and it would have to be expanded upon, I won't claim to be any Ricoeur expert, I always find him very interesting. If we take all that very seriously, then a society that, for example, is perhaps in love with the poetry that Javier is showing, this could be an indication of a society that is literally more limited in its capacities for experience. But as you become limited in those capacities for experience, you also are limited from experiencing that lack. And so you're shrinking. There's a certain shrinking that occurs, that if Miss Dove is correct, that it can be measured by literally the type of art, literature, or language that people use. You can never know for sure if people's worlds are shrinking, but if there's some sort of limiting occurring in language, this could be an indication of that. And you might tie that with Hans Gadamer in Truth and Method as well. So that's something of note. And I like what you were saying on the account. What I would say is, so there's always an interesting idea. So let's take Mr. Ebert's idea on metaphysics. You're writing this piece because basically people, there's this notion that people are like, what is metaphysics? We don't even need it, right? So they kind of just kick it out. What's the point? You're like, well, this is what it does. This is what it is, and this is what it is not, right? So the whole reason you have to write it is, one, in response to a certain dismissal, right? Well, if it's in response to a dismissal, then there's already perhaps an incentive for people to say, I don't get it, or I don't like it, because it's also in the posture of needing to be presented in that way. One of the ways that so then you need to simplify it, but then if you simplify it, people can go, oh no, that's too simple. It's not getting at anything. We don't need that. But then if you make it very complex, they can say, oh, we don't, that's complex and therefore we don't need it because there's a knee jerk if it's not simple, right? So you're already in a kind of, if you're trying to say something that needs to be said, let's put it that way, or trying to defend something that people have dismissed, you're already writing, you don't have the high ground, I suppose. The reader already has you at a certain position of keeping you down. One of the ways that people get around this problem is by using the authority of another writer. Hey, Hegel said this, Plato said this, and they become a scholar and another thinker. And so if you don't get the prose, they can say, well, I didn't write that prose. Socrates or Plato or Aristotle or Hegel wrote that prose, so you can't get mad at me. And are you going to say that Hegel's stupid or Kant is stupid? Some people will, but you use the authority of another intellectual to kind of, in a way, use that to block the critique that I do not understand this, right? But the problem that can occur with that is if there are, say, new thoughts or new ideas that need to be had, that say perhaps about AI or the current global pluralism or different things that will not fit easily into old thinking or old philosophies. You can do it, but it becomes more difficult. Then that methodology becomes more difficult to do. And so what ends up happening is you get philosophers who are, say, Hegel scholars or Kant scholars, where they don't really have to say new things. They say hard things, but if you find them hard and get mad at it, they can say, well, it's not my fault. It's what this thinker said. But that also limits the range of what, say, philosophy can speak to. And that automatically then concedes thinking to other fields, which, of course, can be very important. But if there are limits to what those fields can do, and there actually is something very pressing that philosophy can offer, then that gets removed from the discussion. And who knows what the consequences of that can be if you can't think those things, right? And so likewise, too, if you get trained to think, okay, hard literature that was written in the 1900s by, Dostoevsky, I just keep using that example, that's okay. James Joyce, that's okay, but don't you dare write another Finnegan's Wake. So it's okay to read hard literature that has a name to it because that gives a certain authority to tell the reader, deal with it. But if you try to do that now, it is met with an automatic sort of knee jerk, because who do you think you are? James Joyce or William Gibbons or whatever? Who do you think you are, right? But of course, that means the quality of literature that's presented new has to go down a notch, and that then can lead to crises in these fields. There's more to be said on that, but the fact that people are trapped between well, let me put it this way. If you write something that doesn't refer to the authority of another author, it's probably going to be a personal essay, or it's going to be mixed with your own reflections. It's going to kind of crack it down a notch to be more in the personal essay style, because if someone disagrees, you can say, well, these are just my thoughts and I'm just expressing myself, right? So there has to be defenses you take in the writing to kind of watch this critique. And I'm not saying that that means the personal essay is bad or something like that. But you see why writing, I think you see the kind of writing people put forth reflect this audience problem that actually has real consequences on the kind of ideas that people can think, or the things that can be defended, or the fields that can be brought back. So I think it has a consequence on what people create and what they're willing to think and put out there. But let me give it to Sam. Sam, it is always a treat to have you, ma'am. I hope you are well.
I just wanted to start by saying thank you. I come here and it gives me the opportunity to articulate myself and think through things, and especially like with an audience, just being witnessed, but also like the responses. Like I really feel like this is a space where we talk to each other and not at each other. And yeah, I find it very valuable. And so, you know, I hope that people are able to come to your piece, Alex, and maybe they do encounter, maybe not very many, but do encounter like something where they don't understand it, and instead of like looking at it like you might talk at somebody, they can like look through it, look to it. I wanted to bring into the conversation Charles Taylor's two modes of language, and also his account of like the genesis of language and language acquisition at like a species level rather than just like an organism level. Because I think like the West really has this mixed up. You know, he's got two modes of language that he talks about. He names one constitutive and the other designative. And designative is really easy to understand. It's pre-encoded. It's like it's AA, logical. It's discrete. You know, like we use designative language when we are coding computers. This is a great application of that. But then like constitutive language use is more like the poetic, more like what Javier is talking about. And he divides that then into like two modes of constitutive language, like further into two modes, like human meaning and social footings. And so he's kind of saying like, I like that because on the one hand, it's not just like about a communication of information, which designative language use is, you know, and there might be one sense in which we write what we write in order to communicate concepts. But then I think on the constitutive side, then you have a really good unpacking of why that matters. And exactly as you said, Daniel, like how that allows us, like it's not just that we acquire information through a process of communication, it's that those concepts alter how we see the world. And I really like the way he brings social footings into it, because it also like it fundamentally alters how we relate to each other as well. I mean, language acts like the I do of marriage, like that's you know, it's not just that we decided there's going to be some concept called marriage, and that I do will enact it, and thereafter like that will change how we relate to one another. Like and this goes back to the beginning of language and how humans acquired language. There's not this, there's Taylor's, I mean, I'm kind of leaning on I'm leaning on the authority of another author. Taylor's trying to say that like it's not just that like we were thinking we had all these concepts in our mute mind, and then we found ways of encoding them in through like utterances. Like there was a diachronic unfolding of how our lives related to those utterings, and they like unfolded those human meanings and then allowed for all these social footings. Anyways, I want to bring this up just because um like maybe this kind of relates to the talking at somebody versus talking to. Like a book is like any kind of text sort of is a talking at a person because there's no really response, but at the same time there's a recognition of the kind of audience that you have that is a talking to. And in terms of like dumbing something down, or I don't know, like reducing it's kind of funny because in computer science, when you compress a file, you can, if you compress it to the nth degree, then it actually just becomes purely random. It actually had like, unless you have the piece of code that unpacks that file, it's like completely random. And so it's nonsensical without some kind of like meta encoder. And I think there's like obviously so much utility in compressing something, even just like when you like look at things in different scales, like you have a painting that's really up close, or you look at it far away, like you just get this different perspective on it. And I think that kind of is a good analogy for like compressing something. But I think there is a way in which Rupi Kaur probably has like a certain relationship to her audience that is on the one hand like maybe like based in a fear of like being more complex than society wants them to be. But then on the other hand, I'm sure that there's an infinity to language use in its like apprehension or misapprehension that is probably like productive to any life.
Magnificent, and thank you for everything you said. I very much appreciate that and feel the same way. Thanks to all of you. It's only possible because y'all are here, so thank you. I think what you're saying on talking at and talking with, I'll say very quickly and then give it to Mr. Ebert, Christian, and Javier. You know, for me, I always think about the right relationship to authority, ergo, you know, your Aquinas or Aristotle or whatever. I really like what Schopenhauer says, and where he says, you know, it is not, you know, he says many people in academia now go up to a ladder and they pull off the rungs and they put it in the bag to go and show people, when really we're supposed to climb the ladder. And the idea is what we do is we use authority to kind of show it off. This is what Aquinas said. This is what Aristotle said. We're using it versus using what they said to kind of climb the ladder toward the sun of truth, as maybe Schopenhauer would say, right? Like there's a difference between bringing in what you've read and what you've thought, actually to assist with the talking to and talking with people for the sake of the thought that you're on. You're trying to have a thought unfold versus showing off rungs of a ladder. And anyone who is, we've all met, certainly academics who are using authority to end a discussion or to showcase versus to help the thought, to help the jazz music play, to help the unfolding. That's the difference. And certainly, I don't think that many of the great minds, well, when you read these great, in my opinion, when you read these great minds, they're not writing so that they can be collected like glass beads in the Herman Hesse novel or Pokeballs, or they're not being showed to be showed off. There's Austin Ferris said the genius is in the fingertips. It knows not what it does. They're following something, they're unfolding something, and they're trying to help you follow it as well. The problem is if you don't have a society that believes in that, who doesn't buy into that, who is not reading text to catch something to carry them along, even if they don't know where it's going to go or understand everything. If they don't get in to be carried along, then they stand there and say, I don't get a ladder rung from your article, therefore you owe me. You screwed up. I'm supposed to get something I can show off or use, and you're not. It seems like you're inviting me to think about reality differently. No, what the heck? No. So there's also an issue where if people don't buy into reading as getting onto something that will carry you and, you know, to think with, then people also have this posture of defense against things they don't understand. But part of the fun of life is not understanding and, not knowing what you're going to play in the jazz improv, and yet something's still occurring, not knowing where the conversation's going to go and having it go somewhere. But if you don't have people who are prepared to enter into spaces with that kind of mode, it leads to a lot of issues. And I think that's a major problem. And I think, it doesn't help where if in the class, the other side of this is people are trained to relate to text, the classroom, where you're actually supposed to answer the right questions on the test. It's trivia. Do I know the answer or not? And the teacher can confirm this is the right answer. And if that's when you're trained, when you read something that's challenging something of you, that's actually the thought is unfolding and it doesn't feel like a trivia game, you associate that with a bad article or a bad reading. I think the classroom also teaches the classroom as medium, as Neil Postman would put it, has also hindered our ability to read and to be human from it. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, please.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm just going to say what's fresh, and then I'll circle back to things. I think that there's a relationship between broad dissemination and integration of language and status. So those who broadcast farthest and widest and whose information is broadly integrated have higher status. Obviously, the status game is extremely explicit on something like Substack, where you see the number of likes and the number of reads and the number of reposts. So there's obviously an incentive, a status incentive to speak as broadly as possible. Now, if that status incentive magically happens to align perfectly in terms of its linguistic manifestation with the language that preceded the post, like in other words, the language in your head, or the language you would naturally write down if you thought there was no audience, well, you are a lucky person, right? Because then you don't have the issue of, am I communicating this in the way that it wants to be communicated? There's this issue of, like, I used to describe that music making is more like a celestial archaeology. I'm digging, I find a wing here. Does it fit this neck? No, it doesn't. I don't even know what animal this is. The bones I'm finding tell me what animal it is. Then they only fit together properly if they fit together properly. It'll tell me if it needs another chorus. It'll tell me if it wants a minor chord. These things will tell me, and I think writing is the same way. Now, if you do that and you're listening to what the thing wants, and then you see the thing, and it's difficult language, well, all of a sudden now you're going to risk your status by presenting it to the world in its true form, the form that it told you it wanted to be in, right? So it's a very difficult, it's an ethical, like of almost existentially ethical choice that you have to make, right? No one's going to die, but you feel like a little piece of your fucking spirit dies when you speak untruthfully of your inspirations. And I feel that when I overproduce a song to try and make it a hit, when I know the song does not want it and actually can't bear the weight of that overproduction and speaks more truthfully in a different or raw form, but it won't get as far and wide in that form, it is horrendous feeling. It's like eating meat when you're a vegetarian or something. It's absolutely, you feel wrong. And so I guess the question, it remains, and frankly, I'm obviously not someone who leans on the sort of the status of others to negotiate my own status with you, right? Like, my writing almost never has attributions. I'm almost always presenting new ideas, and those new essays aren't almost ever personal stories. Here's a new theory, motherfucker, like, sink your teeth into this. It's obviously presumptuous. I know that it's going to feel, egoic and so on, precisely because I'm not doing the thing where I'm relying on the, passages and all that. But anyway, so I'm always dealing with this, whether or not it's music, philosophy. It really doesn't matter. There's always this problem. And I wanted to just speak on poetry real quick because I like that was brought up. I think a real palpable example that genuinely pisses me off, like I get actually upset. And I'm going to exclude your poetry from this because I've read some of your poetry that you've been posting and I love it. But you've probably noticed that there is a serious trend in poetry these days, which stems again from a sort of Hemingwayish fetishization of simplicity, not complex. We're not talking necessarily even about concision. In fact, a lot of it is ironically unconcise, prosaic, and the only aspect of it that resembles poetry is that it's truncated. That's it. So you have a sentence like, I went to the market, the ice cream melted. Done. And that is what is hot right now. Now, that's cool. That can be cool in the context of a landscape that is overwrought with flowery poetry. Sure, that's a nice bomb, right? Unfortunately, that is not the current cultural landscape. Instead, the current cultural landscape is a straight plateau of flattened language. And somehow, yet that non-dynamic topography, every contribution to that flatness is still somehow regarded as both more wise in the context of philosophy, more refined, more minimal, more artistic, more auteur in the context of film. Across the board, we see instances of flatness being mistaken as genius. And what I think is all being fueled by is actually like a fear of sticking your neck out, a fear of going for the thing. Like the higher you go, the farther you fall, man. If you stay on that flat line, you're safest as can be. And I think it's so transparent. And in some ways, I almost want to dedicate a lot of my life to just like being like, hey guys, don't you see there's no dynamics here? Yes, sure. Like people will always tell me, oh, I hate flowery language. I'm like, oh, really? Yeah. Name me the most recent book that was flowery language. I dare you. Name one recent hit book. Are you so like congested with flowery twilly? I can't even find anything. You'd have to go back a couple centuries. So don't give me that shit. It's just we've been indoctrinated to, and by the way, again, I keep coming back to this, it's very freak theoretical. Our brains want the path of least resistance. They want to obey the universal principle of least action. And the reason in some ways why we even had, a depth scaffolding, as I like to call it, back in the day, where we had more sort of like difficult language, is because we knew less. We didn't have algorithms sort of like converging us on flatland. And now that we do have that, and we have the option of Netflix, like, yeah, I see the Criterion Collection there. I see Metrograph, I see Mubi, but my brain wants Netflix. So you have to work against that. You know what I mean? Because you literally want to minimize that free energy. I mean, you're working against a genuine biological compulsion. Anyway.
No, I think that's magnificent. And celestial archaeology, that's really, really good. I really like that metaphor. I think also on this idea of conflating flatness with genius. And no, I think I should know. No, the very fact that your work is not I'm going to tell you what Schopenhauer said or some thinker, but it's actually putting forth a new theory. That's the most difficult thing. And that's where the audience attacks tend to come from. And I think a lot of, honestly, intellectuals and people have been trained to not face, they employ methods to not even face this problem. Because, you know, if you don't get it, if you're writing on Schopenhauer or whatever, and the reader doesn't get it, well, you can say, well, that's what Schopenhauer said. I'm actually here to actually, what do most philosophers do? They elucidate a thinker. I'm going to tell you what Schopenhauer said, so you don't have to worry about it. I'm actually in the service of simplifying these philosophers. In that respect, you could argue that many philosophy professors, if we just stick to that, are almost in some way, I don't want to say betraying the spirit of philosophy, but as a medium, it could be training a subconscious association that is, hey, someone who does philosophy is supposed to explain older philosophers to me. And if they're not doing that, they're betraying the social contract. So they're a bad guy, actually. And look, you know, many of the great philosophers spend a lot of time giving you their interpretation of Leibniz or Kant. There's something to be said about philosophers putting themselves under the tutelage of other thinkers to learn what they think, but then they write their own stuff, right? They come to a place where they're then investigating thoughts that need to be there, and they don't spend all their time simply elucidating a previous thinker. And also, too, if one reads Heidegger's books on Nietzsche, I would not say they simplify Nietzsche. There's another different characteristic, right? Like many of these thinkers, when they're talking about someone else, they don't simplify the thinker. In fact, they tell you everything they thought and then add an extra 500 pages. If anything, they make them more elaborate. That's an entirely different mode than the Philosophy 101 class that will explain Kant to you so you don't have to read Kant yourself. I mean, that is also something I think we've been trained by college as a medium or the classroom as a medium that makes us ready to be like, did y'all guys get the memo? Ebert, Jockin on Substack, don't you know this isn't what you're supposed to do? Oh, you know, you're in the wrong. So that doesn't help either. I think just as a quick, and then I'll give it to Christian here. It's very interesting what you say on Hemingway has become a certain problem in people's thinking. Critically, the simplicity was for the sake of making the internal state of the characters unavoidable. So if you have these people who have come out of World War I, and they really have this sort of, dare I say, emptied subjectivity, he's going to, in The Sun Also Rises, basically use the description in a manner to where you cannot avoid facing what is left of this man after the Great War, right? So there's a logic. The simplicity is not for simplicity's sake. It's like, I'm going to bring you in to the place where you really have to feel the devastation that this person has after World War I. It's very critical that Hemingway's style is tied to this particular moment in history when there's the trauma of Great War. Like, people are like, Great War, they didn't even know it could occur. I mean, it's like Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway or different things, right? It is very interesting to compare the early Hemingway with the later Hemingway when you come into a different historical period. And you could, I think, very easily argue his later books don't work. Now, if we'd like to have that literary debate, I'm happy to do it. But when we're looking at In Our Time, The Sun Also Rises, I think his short stories are better than For Whom the Bell Tolls or different things. Because the method of simplicity has to be, in my opinion, tied to a particular technique of trying to make you experience the subjectivity of a particular character or people that have been left behind. But if it's not doing that, if you're simply saying simple language is good, not at all, because it's not tied to what this moment. Literature is always, in my opinion, literary technique is always a reflection in its effectiveness of the particular historical moment it is in. And you could argue when people didn't want to see what was left over, when people didn't want to see what was left over of the men coming back from war or what this had done to people, then a language that forced people to face that or bring them into that internal experience was a very valuable technique. But then what has done is that's been universalized as a way to justify simplicity as the brain wants. And that's where we have a problem. Christian, please.
Hey guys, I mainly have a question for anyone. You brought it up, Daniel, so you might have an answer. There's two little thoughts I had since I came up with my question. One, Alex has inspired me to do a little mini rant, things I'm annoyed with lately. But I'll keep it brief. I'm wanting to write something about as I was just thinking about it, I'm like, should I call it think bait? But it's this way that I guess it's perhaps a symptom of the attention economy, where in order to make some type of idea you have, which is often quite mundane, stick out a little bit more. You contextualize it within a false dichotomy, right? I've traditionally call it actualism, because it's the idea is like, well, you thought this, but actually this. And that seems to, especially for intellectually leaning people, like really grab people, because you're like, oh my God, there's an opportunity here to rewrite my paradigm or something, or that there's like a secret knowledge, or, you know, like I don't want to be one of the people who hasn't gotten up to speed why some idea is outdated or something. I just screenshotted one the other day on Substack. Most people don't have an idea generation problem. They have an idea capture problem. And then a couple paragraphs about capturing ideas. It's like such a mundane thing, like, hey, write down ideas when they come to you. But in order to like sell it in the marketplace of social media, you have to like preface it with this idea of like, the thing that most people think is not the actual thing is, and it's like it's stupid, to be blunt about it, and it's just like, you're seeming perhaps to get rid of like unnecessary complication, where you know, in this idea of like the dichotomy, and but what you're doing actually is, to a lesser extent, depending on the ability of the reader to like see through this, flattening the complexity, right? Because now it's like, well, I mean, it's like the bait might be valuable, but now you've got the hook as well. You know, I don't know if it actually, like, what the net like the net consequence of that is it does it have a net negative impact on people's thinking? Are we becoming more stupid because we're always like, trying to look at things in these contrarian or whatever false dichotomous views? I guess I'm not 100% sure. I just find it annoying, so I'm venting. um, Alex, I'm curious about what you've said about the poetry, about the my ice cream dips and the marketplace as held next to like haikus or something. And I'm not disqualifying what you've said. I'm just like curious how you would think about that thought you've had with, like, you know, the frog jumps into the pond splash or something like that, where, and I guess I'm appealing to like authority here to some extent, because that's a classic poem and everyone loves it, and it was in all our books that we read growing up about poetry and whatever. And maybe it just was a shitty poem, and like, who gives a fuck about the frog jumping into the pond? But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. And then for you, Daniel, the question I had was about um, this really intriguing concept of how the limits of our language limit our ability to experience reality, right? And I remember reading, it was a while back, so, and I didn't do like a deep dive into the academic literature, just kind of the more whatever got published in popular science magazines, but the studies done on different cultures and like the color tests, right? Like, okay, here in this like Amazonian tribe could only identify 10 shades of green, whereas this culture could identify 50 shades or whatever, right? And I don't know if anyone has an answer to this question. I mean, I doubt that research is just like bunk or anything like that. And then there's like the, you know, people used to think blue and gray were the same. There seems to be pretty good historical evidence for that. And yet I feel like, and I might be wrong here, but it's got to be at least a little bit impossible that at some level of consciousness and mental processing that we're not seeing these distinctions. Otherwise you wouldn't have gradients, and there'd be so much data from reality that you're missing that you would like probably die or something, right? So then the question is, okay, at what level of mind are we losing that? Do we have access to that subtle distinction? And at what level do we lose it? Is it just in metacognition, like when we're reflecting on experience and like having to answer a question that all of a sudden we can't see the difference between this green and that green, or what's going on there? I mean, that might be a really difficult question to answer that no one has an answer for, but it's something I'm curious about.
Okay, so I just put up I just looked up, this is in the 10 best poems of the past 10 years. And the poem is, the first one, take 3 or 4 steps, then stop. Look, smell, taste, touch, and hear. Is there anything to eat? Oh, look, there's some caviar. It must be my birthday. Thanks. I must be very old, like 70. Now, this is shit, in my opinion. But the reason why it's considered good is that it's shit. The whole thing hinges on the irony that it's not poetry. And the very simplicity itself satisfies a sort of metamodern or postmodern quotient. It's not in and of itself, it's prose. It's not even, there's nothing about, it's a sentence. It's a run-on sentence. It just so happens to be formatted with no capital letters and formatted like a poem. But this is the kind of thing that pisses me off. So I like some haikus. I think they're beautiful, right? Especially like, you know, like there's a whole thing, and especially when you're in the sort of the pocket of the sort of Japanese haiku, you know, snow falling on cedars and so on. It's all like, okay, I get that there's this sort of like reverence baked within this in some context. And in a lot of ways, much less is more. But once you get into these, I've just been reading a lot of like poetry lately because I'm putting together a poetry book, and I'm just so appalled at the level of poetry that yeah, I almost feel like I'm up against a mountain of stupid, and my like, oh God, I have to add in. I've literally been like, okay, I have to literally pepper this poetry book with bad poems in order for it to get published. You know, and so I'm trying to make my bad poems good poems, you know, like bad good poems, like ironic TV and whatever. And I like doing it. It's not that I don't like doing it. I think it's really fun to do. It's super cool, but like it's just the irony itself is ironic and so on. But yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I think I was unmuted as I laughed really hard, so I hope y'all enjoyed that. So I'll give it to you know Rivera.
Oh, just as one last thing. I have a poem in my book now that says that it is literally, the title is "This is not a poem," and the poem is "Yes, it is." Like I'm just commenting, like some of the poems I'm just like commenting on the state of poetry. But like that, you know, that's like a spicy, like that's like that passes today, and that's where we're at, and that's fine. It's all postmodernism and whatnot. But like you said, if everyone is taking a heterodox point of view, do we have topology? Or do we have like pure difference, which is static? And one area where we see this thing, and I definitely do the thing you mentioned, which is like, you thought this, but it's actually this. You see that everywhere. In one place you see that everywhere is the alternative health, right? Like all the Maha stuff, like everything is like, you thought it was this oil, but it's that oil. You thought milk was bad, but it's good. You thought fat was bad, but it's good. You thought this was good, but it's bad. And it's all of like, they're all selling you something. Obviously it's all predicated on sort of like that moment of like, I'm doing the wrong thing. I don't want to be in the, you know, out of the know. Like, you know, there was a time when no one would eat bread. Now the coolest thing to do is like find a really good artisanal loaf of bread. Like it's just constant asymmetry swapping. But I'm working on a Substack right now, which is like, you thought it was minimum, you know, minimizing free energy. It's actually maximizing free. So I do the, you know, we all do that. But yeah, it ends up creating a flatness too. And I feel a little transparent when I do that. And here we are. We just, you know, we use these tropes, I guess.
Well, I think very often literature employs techniques to bring one in, but when literature simply becomes about a showcase of techniques that have a certain niftiness to them, and then you move on, then that's part of the problem. Like a lot of times, you're playing with the idea that if I take a normal line and simply do a line space and not capitalize it, it creates an effect of a depth. That then is kind of like, oh, that's interesting. But the work, for one, is not actually asking you to carry it with you. In your, well, there's something, what does Scruton say? Like the great poetry is stuff that actually kind of lives and births inside of you and changes how you experience. So there's always like this idea where you can always in literature create neat techniques that become kind of interesting because they're nifty. But what ultimately are the techniques serving? I would argue, like, so for example, if we were speaking of Joyce, without going too much into this, and I'll give it to Javier, Michelle, Mr. J, etc., is that I think, like, I greatly prefer Ulysses to Finnegan's Wake because Mr. Joyce became very interesting in his ability to infinitely come up with literary techniques, but ultimately sacrifices the possibility of a Molly Bloom, yes, 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 at the end of Ulysses, or using the Odyssey with different episodes for a dame in Dublin that actually is inviting you into a deeper experience of subjectivity that becomes emotionally unforgettable. And I actually think his greatest work is The Dead, because there are extremely genius inventions of modern technique in that. But one, when they're left with the snow softly falling and faintly falling upon all the living and the dead, I reread that short story every year because of the depth that goes on forever. Or like this poem by Wallace Stevens called The Snowman, this first paragraph, one must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow. I could keep going. But there's one, the mind of winter could be the play on the word regard means you're thankful for the frost, or you acknowledge it because you have a mind of winter that is frozen from being able to think, so all you can do is see everything in terms of frost and bros. The point I'm going to make is I once wrote a 30-page paper on this single space and gave it to Kevin Hart. When you come upon these sort of poetry and you can go through the lines and see how Wallace Stevens has picked every single one of these words, that it seems like a very simple poem on the surface, but when you start seeing how he is using terms like regard or mind of winter and how that's playing with the four stance and how that's actually opening up an entire theory of experience, well, then you see that it's not using its technique simply to entertain, but actually in service of something that you can revisit and go on and go on and go on. So there are differences like that. And the idea of actualism is really, really great, Christian, because I think, well, that gets into, you can always go, well, yeah, Republicans are bad and Democrats are bad, but they're also both right. Ooh, it creates this impression of thinking because I'm taking a kind of middle. There's all these kind of moves you can do that create an impression of thinking, but actually they're more just like literary techniques as opposed to inviting you into a greater unfolding. But because it creates a certain feeling of insight, in the same way that spacing prose funny on a page can create a feeling of depth, then they can function as certain tricks. I think honestly, it's a temptation to do that sort of thing that writers and thinkers should avoid, but the temptation is so strong because it can expand reach. There's more to be said on what Christian was saying about experience and what does it mean to say there are limits to our experience. This is a very important question, but I'll give it to Javier. Mr. Rivera, please.
You know, when Ebert talks about poetry, I'm like, fuck, dude. I know I've been committing these sins for years before I was like, let me take poetry seriously. And I still think I'm committing them, but like, at least I'm like, fuck, I'm like really trying to avoid it. And it's funny because it reminds me of like when I was talking to my sibling about like love poems are fucking horrible. Like they're horrible to write. And he was like, why? And I was like, well, I can tell you why. It's because it sounds fucking cheesy every time you write it. I was like, a good love poem, like try to write a good love poem without it being fucking cheesy. Like that's how you know simplicity is complex, right? Because everybody's experienced this emotion of love, and then you can't just you start writing it out, and you're like, this is so cringe, dude. Like this is so cringe. I want to vomit, and like I haven't written a love poem in like years because of that shit. The one poem I did write, which actually you, Daniel, and Sam have read it, which is the one about the bird popping out from the cavity of the cactus's chest. right? And I say an unexpected appearance, right? Because I was like, I don't know what love is, but I guess it's that. A bird popping out of a dead cactus, right? Like, you know, um, and like for me, I'm still thinking like that's my best love poem yet because I was like, uh, it doesn't sound cheesy to me. It didn't sound like I would regret it in like 10 years. You know, it didn't sound like I would regret it in maybe 2 years. Um, but another point that I wanted to get at is this. Luber, go ahead, ask your question. You got it, bro. You got the floor. Come on, man. Say it.
Sorry. Okay. My question is, I guess, based off of a fear that I have. So maybe I'm already starting at the wrong place, but like at a certain point, isn't when you use this like non-dash, whatever the noun is, like non-poetry, non-whatever, I'm thinking about Daniel's non-rational. At a certain point, it's like, oh, like that person over there, they're eating their own shit. Could you make the argument that somehow that's like non-rational, or is that just like inhumane? Like that's just not what it is. Like you just shouldn't be doing that if you're a human being or something like that. Like at a certain point, it's like, oh, that's just not poetry. Like I don't understand this meta modern move where you're basically saying, oh, it's just bad poetry on purpose. Like to me, I'm like, no, that's just not poetry. And that is just stupid. And people are just stupid. Like that's what my mind is going to with that. And not, there's like this wiggle room where we're using this non, and I'm scared that it might be misplaced, essentially, where to me, the non is more about not doing something bad on purpose, but doing something different to bring out basically difference. Like, oh, I'm doing this quasi poetry to bring out a new form of poetry. That's where like the non to me makes the most sense. But I just wanted to ask, at what point do we just say, no, that's just stupid, wrong, this entire culture or whatever is just wrong. But I'll listen to the rest when you post on YouTube. I do got to go though. Here, say hi to Alex real quick. Wave, it's Daniel.
Alex, Well, tell Alex we said hello. He's beautiful. Good to see him. I love you,
He
Alex.
says love you.
Aw.
All right. Peace, guys.
Best to
Thank
you,
you,
sir.
Thank you, Javier.
Mr. Rivera, sir, I throw it back at you. It's a wonderful question.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, it's something that I'm still struggling with because, like, in some sense, like, I totally sympathize with Ebert, but then I'm also just like, well, even poets have had feuds about what the fuck poetry is and what it's supposed to mean. You take Carlos Williams Carlos and what's his name, Pound. That they've quibbled about what poetry is supposed to mean and what it's supposed to do as a function. And so, like, what's the difference between a movement in poetry that's valid versus it's just shit? It's just shit. And so, like, even when Chris brought up the idea of haikus, I'm like, this is why, like, haikus, like, every time I think about doing a haiku, I'm like, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing because it just looks so simple. And then I'm like, but maybe I just don't get it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, I am out of my territory when I think about doing haikus because of the demand for it to be compressed. And it's like, it's purposely compressed. And this is actually something I was going to tell Ebert when I discovered that you released your metaphysics article today. I didn't read all of it, but like I got to the part where you said Jim Rutt or like Jim, anytime somebody says metaphysics, they start grabbing their gun, right? And I thought about this like two poetic lines. I was just gonna do like a little poetry post about it where I was gonna say there's two senses. Metaphysics doesn't matter and metaphysics doesn't matter. And I wasn't gonna explain anything about it. But like me explaining it now is me saying there's the indifferent sense, which is metaphysics doesn't fucking matter, which is, the guy reaching out for the gun. And then there's metaphysics doesn't matter as to say somehow metaphysics ironically constitutes a reality in which metaphysics doesn't matter, in which someone could say metaphysics doesn't matter. It allows me to say that. And then I was like, but the reason why I didn't even post it because I was baiting myself because I was like, I feel like I need to explain this, you know, because I feel like I'm gonna get fucking trolled by people and be like, actually, metaphysics does matter, and I'll be like, actually, you're an idiot, you know, like, but that's like one of the things that like made me laugh. But I think on a personal level, though, what makes me relate to this the most is my own relationship to my partner, where she struggled with philosophy like completely. And it's an authority problem. Like it's because she feels like she can't engage with me because already I'm seemingly speaking from a position of authority because I know the material. Even though I'm like, you guys met me. I don't know shit. I've just read a couple of books. But like for the average, like for any person, like it's just like, well, he knows more than me, so he's an authority. Um, and interestingly enough, we started reading poetry together as a way to like combat this authority problem. And it's just kind of like been like really fascinating experience to me because I was like, so why is it that poetry levels the ground in which none of us are experts in this, even though in philosophy it's the case too in a way, like we're not the expert, but it's like it's a bad word, you know. It's like a philosophy deserves a category in which authority and expert is not the word we use. It shouldn't be the word that we use, because it's not. It's like when Aristotle talks about, you know, it's a science, but like it's not a science, right? Because it's not the specificity of the science. It doesn't have that specifications of a science. So it's like it deserves a different word, and that's why we call it metaphysics. But you can see now the trouble that we have that with understanding metaphysics is that people are going, well, you're in a specific field, and that means that you can either be disregarded or not, because now you're just talking mumbo jumbo because you're in such a specific field. But it's like actually philosophy is that field where it's so specific about generalities that it's ironic. You can't actually get more specific because then you start going into a science. You know, you start going into, you're supposed to lay down the foundation as to what is. And so what is the is? And that's all confusing for people. And so even the categories of expert is not a valid term, I would say. Even authority is not a valid term. And I was even talking to my girlfriend about how I hate fucking the word hobby. I hate hobby because it doesn't encapsulate what I care about. Like if you talk about you just like watching football, okay, that's a hobby, right? But if I like reading philosophy, that's not a hobby. So just because it's not economically viable for me, or like writing poetry is like not economically viable for me, it's not a hobby to me. So it's like it deserves a third category. And like, what is that? We don't have a third category for that. Because typically we just call that a profession. Well, we call that a profession in relation to economics, right? So what is it that is life-giving, that is a word for it, that isn't hobby? Because that, I mean, if I'm talking about things that irritate me, that irritates me. Like they're like, it's just your hobby and you fucking think about shit and, you know, you go about your day, you know? But yeah, enough said there.
Well, that's magnificent. And the word hobby is a problematic term. I'll give it to Michelle, Mr. Jockin, and Michael. So there's a few things on this idea. So on like what is poetry, what is lit. So there's a few things. First, it is always very interesting how much, say, rewriting, editing, tearing down, balling up, rewriting, many, in my opinion, great writers do, where I'm not sure if many, now I'm speaking very generally, one has to question a poem that is not rewritten 5,000 times, where a person goes, oh, this expresses myself, people will like it, and they put it out. There is something to be said about, can something be called poetry that doesn't try to kill you? that it's after you in a way as you write it, or it's something like you're like the celestial archetype, like you're putting it together. I do want to, although there's a few things, although it might be difficult to say what is poetry when it's a product, you could enter this debate. I do wonder if the experience of writing poetry is very undebatable versus just writing sentences that people can like. Like it is interesting to read the biographies of writers and poets and playwrights and different things. Their relationship to the process of writing is very different, in my opinion. There's a lot going on, and perhaps the question of what is poetry needs to consider the process of its genesis, not just people's opinion about the product. There's something there that I think is interesting to consider. I think it's also interesting to consider, you know, when Eliot is writing The Wasteland, you know, Pound famously erases a whole lot of it. You know, he just tears it out. He's like, you're an idiot, man. What's so interesting is that T.S. Eliot was basically like, you're right. It wasn't like, this is my expression, you have to give it. No, there was much more of a like, you're the master, you know what you're talking about. And you could argue that although the cantos by Ezra Pound, like even please note, you know, you could argue, you know, Harold Bloom did not like the cantos by Ezra Pound, but it's quite obvious that Ezra Pound poured his heart into the cantos, like years and years. But isn't it interesting that just because Ezra Pound poured so much time into this book does not necessarily mean it's good poetry, right? So there's a few things that are going on here, right? There's these questions of, yes, he kind of poured it in, but then, you know, there's this idea that it actually lost the emotional effect. But I think but let me put it this way. Even if you were to say the cantos of Ezra Pound are not good, I think it would be hard to argue that Ezra Pound was not a poet. So there are different questions here as well, right? You know, perhaps, you know, what is a poem and what is a poet seem to also be different questions. We often get tied up in the question of, is this poetry or not? Well, was it written by a poet? Is a different question. I think Ezra Pound was clearly a poet. He also had a special gift, apparently, for, I want to say editing, but what he did is not what most editors, he was like in the creative process in a very deep way. He was also a pretty profound liaison between many of the people in Paris, I suppose. Where he was, he knew many of the creatives and different things. So there's a few questions that can be asked that might help with the line of inquiry. Even if it's hard to say what a poem is, it might be easier to say what a poet is, and therefore to assume that something that a poet makes is a poem, or at least better approximating it. I think the other thing that's just very interesting is when we look at that, I'm just using that period of time, one could argue that modernist literature is defined by a certain interest in the internal state. And you could say Keats, maybe as a playwright, is one of the births of this, right? So obviously by the time we get to James or Conrad with Secret Agent, there's a focus on what's called focalization and different things, right? So there's this kind of interest in the internal state because there's a change in the zeitgeist where people are interested in subjectivity. Well, when Gertrude Stein is writing, they're literally mystified by what the word is. Like, what are we doing when we write? What is this, actually? If it's not just information, if there's an internal state that's not captured in the word, what is a word? And it's just very interesting that the very process of writing literature was tied to learning who we are and what we are, actually creating artifacts of subjectivity by which to study subjectivity, because the notion of the subject is really kind of being birthed in modernity. Now, that's obviously a simplification, but really, if you take my word for it, if we want to go back to the Odyssey versus the Torah, or reading Auerbach, a good book for this kind of stuff is Momentus by Auerbach on the history of these different writing forms. But you see increasingly a certain movement to the internal state. And you see, when they back then, I love what Mr. Ebert said about they could afford to ask these questions. When they're asking questions of what is poetry, there are real stakes to this. It's like, what is poetry? Because what is the subject? What is the person? What are we, dang it? So there's this idea that writing is tied to something with real stakes that we're trying to investigate. Like when you read Gertrude Stein, and it seems to all be nonsense, she basically has a theory that you can't write nonsense is basically what she's trying to show. That if you stream of consciousness, a logic nevertheless arises that is a certain grammar that's binding it all together, that if you actually look, you'll see that it's almost impossible for the human to make nonsense. Now, one has to go into what Gertrude is doing, because he also, I believe, was in the laboratory with William James. So he's very interested in psychology and how the mind works, right? So here's the idea. Literature has to be an investigation into something. And the only way to get at the something is through this literature that the poet and the writer is getting at. So, there's this idea that the novel, like, what's the meaning of the poem? In a way, that's what they're doing, but it's a much higher stake. Who is the person writing what is this thing we are doing that is poetry? Is that the meaning of the poem, or is it something that is a deeper phenomenological analysis that's basically asking what are the conditions necessary in human subjectivity to make the creation of a poem possible, and it possible to make sense of it, and possible to investigate it, and possible to orbit for an entire lifetime and come back at things forever, right? So if that is all a certain, and then I'll give it to Michelle, a certain quality of what makes literature literature, the question is the following. Is that the mode by which people are writing poems today? Are they trying to create some sort of artifact that has some sort of stakes that they're trying to unfold to themselves? Or are they simply trying to get clicks? Perhaps it is difficult to say if it is a poem or not, but I don't think it's difficult to say it's not in the spiritry of poetry. It's not in the spirit of poetry. Because the spirit of poetry is one that is desperately asking, what are we doing in the writing of a poem that if we don't take seriously, we lose something that if we lose, we won't even have the ability to know we've lost it, and what then? I think that is a very different disposition, but let me give it to Michelle. Michelle, please.
Yeah, so good to see you all. Hope you can hear me. I took out my earbuds. But yes, this has been a wonderful discussion. And I just had two quick thoughts. One is from like way back when Ebert was talking about people throwing shade at his article. And it made me think about a memory when I was in Cape Town in South Africa, when I was, I don't know, very young, like maybe 7 or something like that. And I remember like, I can speak Afrikaans a little bit, but I'm not like super fluent, the language of the Afrikaans people in South Africa. Anyways, also the Cape Town people have a pretty strong dialect, like not dialect, but like accent in a way. So anyways, they were talking, my aunt and my uncle and my mom and my dad were talking, and I was just listening as a child, listening to them talk. And I picked up things here and there, but some like they all started laughing because a joke had been said, but I didn't really understand. I didn't understand what the joke was, but I just knew to like laugh with them, or like you just laugh with them because something's been said that's funny. But I say that, I bring up that story because it made me think of the comment you had highlighted, Ebert, where like the person's like, you should say this so that I can understand it. I think it was the man from Greece or something like that. It made me think about like how it would be kind of absurd for me to like go to be in that place with the elders of my family and say like, you should make this understandable to me. Like it would make no sense to do such a thing. I mean, it would be a little bit audacious, but also it would be like, translate this, like, make your language my language. It's not my language, it's your language. Like, I think that's for me what I think about philosophy often is is that it's another language. So if you vibe with that language and you're willing to kind of be vulnerable enough for that language, awesome, and be there for it and receive from it what you can and engage with it as much as you want to or can. But I think the internet has like made us feel like we should be able to speak this like universal language. And we don't have, like, yes, there's a universal language of like being human, like we all have emotions, we can all understand that, That's a cool thing, right? That's a cool thing that can connect us. But the fact that we should have like this sort of, you should, like this almost like assumptive attitude that it should make sense to me just because I'm also somebody on the internet. No, this is a different language. It may not make sense to you. That's okay. That's totally okay. And if you would like to keep grappling with it, maybe you can learn it too. You don't have to though. Like you really don't. But if you want to get vulnerable and make a lot of mistakes, that's how I always think about language. It's like, You know, it's like the process of actually loving, because you have to make a lot of mistakes along the way. It looks silly, but eventually you learn that language, and it's a beautiful thing, and you can actually commune and communicate. So that was the one thought. Just like, I thought that's interesting how just the nature of the medium, like we're on the internet, it's being received on the internet. So then there's this assumption that anyone from anywhere should be able to understand this, you know, like a meme or something, you know, it's like, no. But I mean, that's why these kind of reduced forms of communication and information exchange do become popular, and that there's something funny and fascinating and kind of, you know, yeah, reductionistic, but also neat about it, that like we can all laugh about a meme, whether you're in like Thailand or in America or, you know, Greenland or whatever. So yeah, and then that was the one thing I was gonna say. Then the other thing I was gonna say was on the poetry. Oh, I guess it's just, my thought is like this, because it can get very much like, well, is there a place for the Instagram poetry, or is it just nonsense, da da da. I think for me, it's like time will tell, right? It's like, does a person, if the person's actually a poet, like if that's the essence of their, like if that's their being, right? It will continue, like it will continue, and sometimes it will be great, and sometimes it'll be really bad, and sometimes it'll be really short, and sometimes it'll be really long, and sometimes it'll be really interesting, and sometimes it'll be really boring. But if they are truly that, like time will tell. Now the thing is we live in these like instant, like the nature of Instagram is like all these instances, right? So it's like we unfortunately, to Jockin's point, he's brought up before about like kind of time, right? Like the longevity of things, right? Like we forget, and we don't always esteem that element where somebody's actually consistent, like, or maybe there's some dry spells, it's okay, but like they end up always coming back around to it, and they keep on with it. And I think that like the relentless nature of returning to that form will ultimately, I don't know, in a way speak to what that art is, or like the goodness, truth, and the beauty of what it is. And what that means is like time will tell. And again, sorry, to clarify my point is that on Instagram, it's hard for us to have that barometer, because there's just some other Instagram poet, some other, like there's all this multiplicity and infinitude, that it almost seems like this like no face generality of you know, the Instagram poet, you know, almost archetype or something still out there, and they're just being consistent because it's just always popping up. So it's hard because it gives the illusion that that's there, but it's not. Some people will actually continue writing their poems, and some people will not. They'll do it for like, you know, they'll just have a little phase of it, which is fine. No, that's no problem. And it's just the case. Like if it is the case that that person is a poet, or that is poetry, to me, it has a lot to do with that the process itself, and the ultimate like return to that craft and that form. And you know, it, because I think it gets difficult in terms of it being like, I don't know, poetry is such a weird thing. It's such a funny form. Like I do find the relationship to it very, very funny and odd. And I remember when I was in like 2012, I remember being like, I don't even know why I said this, but I was like, I'm gonna be a poet, you know. And I'm just like, and it's funny to think back on that time and why I even like felt that way or even said that out loud. But I do remember that, and I remember getting like, a very funny reaction from my dad, who basically just sort of like, you know, in a nice way, like chuckled about it, you know. So I think the thing is that there's something about time will tell. I mean, for lack of a, like, sorry, this is not that profound, guys, but it's just, the idea is like time will tell. But I think it is fascinating to think about how time will tell as it relates to these different mediums and these different forms and these different like interfaces that we engage with the material and with those behind that material. And I will say, like, I think the poetry that always I mean, it's neat for me when poetry has ideas behind it, or I know the person, right? That's always where it's really rich, because I know it's from them, because I care about that person, you know, I care about, like, so it's cool to see what comes forth from that person, whether it's a poem, a dance, you know, a really cool, like, intricate philosophy essay. It's like, that's awesome. Like, that's, you know, that's Ebert's, that's Javier's, that's Daniel's. Like, it's cool. But yeah, I think I don't know. there could be a whole nother tangent on just like the relationship phenomenologically with poetry and how funny of an art form it is. And I don't even know, sometimes it's just like, is this like, is just this being done? Like, I can think about it from my own perspective from writing, where it's like, do I just do this because it's brief? Like, do I like this form? Do I gravitate towards this form because it's brief? I also have little brief moments, you know, like in the day, right, where it's like, okay, it feels much more in reach for me to be able to do it, because it's like, okay, I can actually encapsulate a little idea here. I can encapsulate a little wordplay here. And I can, it feels like something that I can at least do. And it's at least doing something. And that's, again, the silver lining to the Instagram poets is like, you might get poets who never read poetry, and it's honestly what they're producing might be like, you know, Ebert's categorization of it, right? But maybe it does send somebody to, you know, to the great canon of poets. Maybe it sends somebody there. Like, they started Instagram and they end up going to the library. I hope so. You know, I really hope so. Unfortunately, though, that may not be the case in mass, but maybe there's still some hope in that, I think, you know. I don't know, just a little couple of thoughts, but thanks, guys.
No, well, a few things, and then I'll give it to Mr. Jockin, Michael, and Javier. I love what you said about, oh, they should have to speak it in English. It's not imperialism, honest. You know, how dare you speak in Afrikaner? And I think that's a wonderful association with the idea of make it simpler, speak it in my English. And it's actually, because as I was saying that, there is something that feels imperialistic about the audience that demands to be spoon-fed. But it's almost like when you scapegoat the scapegoat, and therefore it's not scapegoating. We almost see the person who's trying to say something new or difficult as a kind of imperialist, or they have power. So if you tell them to make it simple and kind of force them, it doesn't feel like you're being imperialistic, because we have some sort of training where we tend to interpret someone who is saying something difficult as they see themselves as better than you, is almost what we associated with. Oh, they're saying something difficult. Well, they must think they're better than other people. Therefore, it's okay if I bring them down to size. But it really is a certain imperialism when you demand people to bring things into a simpler language or make it more accessible, but we don't see it as a power move in the same way that if you scapegoat the scapegoat, if you scapegoat oppressors or whatever, then it's not scapegoating. It has this sort of veiling that occurs. And I think that's part of it. I think there's a way in which people feel as if, how dare you, try to say something difficult? So it's okay if I bring you down to size. I think it's a massive problem, and it really is a kind of imperialistic thing. Really, the joy is just letting the language wash over you. I'm always amazed reading some of again, when you read biographies of great writers, in my opinion, many of them just love the sounds of words they don't understand. They enjoy just listening to other languages. They don't have any idea whatsoever, but they just like the language, the music of the words, which is always very interesting, because they're learning to appreciate not understanding. They're learning to see a music and there being something they don't get, right? I think that's very important. I think basically the right disposition of reading is to let the thing wash over you, almost baptismal. Don't worry if you get every detail. Don't worry if it all comes upon you. Let it wash over you. You can always reread it. You can come back to it 2 days later. You can come back in 10 years later, actually, in different things. Like, there are some books I try to reread every 3 years because I know, well, actually, it's more like 5. It was going to be 3, but then it became 5 because, one does not get back to War and Peace every 5. But it's funny how when you reread a book, you realize how much you didn't get. And actually, perhaps you had to be 40 before you got it. Oh, actually 50, actually 60. And aging, there is something about aging that is necessary for reading, in my opinion, great works, actually. Like the reread, actually, C.S. Lewis said you don't read a book that you don't read twice. I always like that. And I think many of the great works, and I do think, look, the moment you say great works, we're in a society that's like, well, you can't say that. Well, there is something about a work I question its greatness if upon rereading it doesn't bring a new life. Like if it can't be reread and be like, oh my gosh, I never saw that. Oh, I never thought about that. Like it has this certain ever deepening, like a grape ripening on the vine. That seems to be a key characteristic of something very important, but I'd have to expand upon that. But the reread, we're in a culture that is not trained to reread, right? So if we don't get it the first time, it's bad, right? But in a culture trained for rereading, then if you don't get it, well, of course you didn't. You're going to reread it. I think perhaps a benefit of some religious traditions, if you're reading a very difficult Bible or text, is like, of course you don't get it. You're going to read the same book or the same passage 500 times the rest of your life, and then maybe kind of sort of you'll get a kind of glimmer of it. You're going to reread these texts over and over again until you get it. Now, you can do that, can go too far, of course, but there's also something extremely important of having somewhere in your society a regular practice of submitting people to texts that they don't fully get, that actually they then develop that muscle of the reread and the rethink and the rethink. I think also what you were saying on poetry, I think another just key idea as well with poetry is there isn't, often poetry is written in response to the zeitgeist or the mode of subjectivity people have that needs to be broken up in order to open them to new conditions of possibility. So what I mean by that is much of the blank verse, I guess blank verse, which a lot of the problem is tied to blank verse now, right? Like if you read a villanelle, even if you thought it was bad, you would go, well, villanelles are not exactly easy to read, write, especially if it's iambic pentameter, something like that. So even if you thought even if it was bad, you would at least feel okay to say it's a bad poem, not to ask if it's poetry. It's like, well, that's a villanelle. So it's a poem. It's bad, but it's a poem, right? Blank verse is when you start asking if it's even a poem, right? Like if it's in iambic pentameter, you say, that's a poem. I don't like it, but it is a poem, right? So there's also an issue where blank verse has confused the subject, right? And you could easily say, if there wasn't blank verse, someone who couldn't write, say, iambic pentameter or villanelle, a villanelle, I just use those examples. Obviously, there's sonnet and many more. Well, you would say, well, then you're not a poet, because a poet can write a sonnet. A poet can do iambic pentameter. Very simple. The problem is once you open up blank verse, then you feel like you can't say anymore, right? So blank verse has caused a lot of confusion. Now, why did blank verse arise? I guess the first, I don't know if this is true. Faust is blank verse. I guess a lot of Tennyson is blank verse. Blank verse is modern. It's more new, right? One could argue blank verse is also a response to an overly formalized subjectivity that then is stuck in a narrow range. So you need Walt Whitman, okay, it leaves that would be blank as well, right? So you have some sort of restriction of the individual. And what does form do? Form restricts individual. And so there's this certain, what poetry is getting at is in response to a certain condition subjectivity is to open it, right? Because you could even say when you start getting into sonnets or poetry as well, these are different from proverbs. Like most poetry is going to be tied to proverbs or religious texts or different things. The idea of starting to do poems that are about romance, that can be even sex. Oh my gosh, are you out of your mind? So there's a certain opening of subjectivity there, right? And as you're introducing new forms that are not found in, say, the Bible, like the villanelle, you're opening new forms, right? So there's these openings, right? One could argue, perhaps stuck under in the time of capitalism versus communism in the Cold War, now I'm getting to Ousi, like this sort of breaking up of the blank verse was actually quite necessary because people were being sort of trapped into a certain conformity that you're trying to free people from, right? So the point I'm getting at is the following. How does blank verse now open up subjectivity? Like open up the subject? If the answer is it's not doing anything, then it's not what we need now. I think poetry has an ear to the tracks, if you will, a deep awareness of the ways that we're being captured. And its forms have to, if the forms are simply reiterating our capture, if we're now captured by, dare I say, a zeitgeist of blank verse, then perhaps a return to the villanelle is precisely what you need. A return to the iambic pentameter, but in a unique way. And please also know, once you get to four quartets or Wasteland or the Rock, all of that, the Wasteland is using blank verse to introduce a poetry following a logic of association. Now, I have to get into the Wasteland. There is a new, you're moving the form to a new logic of connection based on allusion. The memory is the logic of the poem, and trying to create an order out of fragmentation. These fragments I saw against my ruin, London Bridge is falling due, shanty, shanty, shanty. Also, the peace that passes understanding, does that mean we gain it or it's forever, right? You're using cultural allusions to create a new form. Here's the key. T.S. Eliot, as just another example, is blank verse because the idea is that, well, we don't have order anymore after World War I and in modernity and different things. We're trying to create a new order out of, say, a tradition, but that's fragmented, doesn't even work. So you're not using blank verse simply for personal expression or to say whatever you want to say, but to make the logic of the poem move from the form to the internal operations of the language itself, right? So this was an unlocking of subjectivity at the time. So what I would say is that other than the question of what is poetry or what is not, poetry, in my opinion, has a certain awareness of the modes by the ways that we've been captured and is trying to free us from that capture. If poetry on Instagram is not doing that, then perhaps it is experienced to people as poetry, but it ultimately, I would hesitate to call it poetry that is fulfilling its own spirit, because it is not in service of this opening of the conditions of possibility of subjectivity, because blank verse is the logic now in today's 2025 world. Blank verse is a logic of personal expression, of which is the logic of capital and the logic of markets and selling products, right? Blank verse, when one is captured by a cultural logic that is oppressive, is a liberation of the subject, but now it is a repetition of the zeitgeist, arguably, that is problematic. So I think poets are writing they're also writing not entire novels so that it can reach more people, but what you're trying to reach more people is an alternative way of thinking that will help them move out of the capture of the zeitgeist. So you're using the shortness for the spread, for the liberation, if you will, from that capture or opening up new modes. You're not using the shortness of the poem because it's easier to sell, right? So that's also a different reason to use the poem. There's more to be said on what you said about Michelle, to continue to do it, and time will tell. I guess it was Bloom again who said that perhaps Ashbery with the concave mirror will be one of the few poets who survived the cruelest cutting block of all, which is the cutting block of time. I think there is something to be said about that, but let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
The issue when we get so many people joining in the call, now there's so much to talk about. So I feel like my responses are so spread out because I have so many notes in response. Obviously, I have to bias my points by saying I stand hard for historicism and using citation scholars. I mean, that's basically my entire way of thinking is based on that. And it is very much the actualism point. This is like pedagogical training 101 it is frustrating when you see it and it's done badly. It sets up this is where the problem, straw men show up. You set up parameters of distinction that are very forced, right? And then you beat up the false premise that you presented and make your case of demonstration that you thought it was this, it's actually this. See, the problem is that we actually learn discernment by contrast. That's the reason why we do, that's a method, that's why we do that in teaching and instruction, is drawing out distinction. And it's when not done well, it causes this kind of lame actualism kind of approach. I think that is it's a fair critique. However, I wanted to defend it, especially in the context of tradition. I agree with this point, not just as the other aspect of it, a dead repetition. Really, and by the way, my comments about thought is actually really rare. Applies even to the highest level of sophistication of what content we're working with. If you're just simply regurgitating, here's a good example. If you are citing Aristotle or Aquinas, and you are not aware that there are paradigm differences of their line of thought versus modernity, if you're not aware of it, and you're just replicating the information, that is not thought. At least I would present that. That is reproductional regurgitation. That's what that is. So I think that's a bad use of tradition. And also the kind of using also modes of kind of authority, basically proof by authority. But because Aristotle said it, it's true. I mean, that's a fallacy if you do it that way. What's more interesting is when, and this is usually the case, is actually why I'm such a strong proponent of history and tradition, is as you brought up, Daniel, the kind of philosophy 101 intro course that gives you the Cliff Note edition of the thinker and their thought versus going to see the proper, what did they actually say? Meaning going from secondary citations or secondary literature or history to primary is a world of difference. You actually find out there's all this complexity and relationships and nuance. Actually, very famously, I mean, to me, is the notes of lack in Aristotle. It's right there. It's in all the texts. It's everywhere. But yet, when you actually read most scholarship, it's usually dismissed. It's very not the norm discussion for when we talk about Aristotle or anyone even interpreting Aristotle. Aquinas is one example of that. So that's always kind of, from my point of view, why we need this kind of tradition, just this to start our way of. It kind of helps you out because it gives you an orientation of thought. But to just stop there and not realize usually some kind of contrast or distinction in the thought, that's where I think your take is relevant, like where we have a role to play. So we're not just regurgitating the information, we have to then take it, show its contrast. And usually, and it's not necessarily problematize it by default, but certainly showing complexity in any basic notion. And actually, I'll just put a note on this. So actually, on this question, what is poetry? And the confusion you're bringing up, Daniel, with blank verse, is when the formal constructional as demand or norm of what poetry is got obliterated, just like fine art did with Duchamp and the Fountain. It obliterated craft. Once craft, the concern of formal arrangement and composition, once that got obliterated, is that, actually, no, you can do art without composition, with awareness of intention of that in that domain. Then you're kind of stuck with a big puzzlement. What is art? What is poetry? Once you kind of divorce from craft in that way. Now, actually, this is the case where I want to point out Aristotle might be useful. Aristotle's comment about what poetry is the mimetic of life. It's imitation of life. It's really interesting because then you actually lead to a larger part about that, which is it's a kind of mode of you're talking about, Daniel. What I'm hearing from you is it's a mode of inquiry. It's actually a way, and I think Alex had it in the chat. It's a way of actually inquiring into what is life, what is it to live, and that I think expression is really very important because actually it points out what's the problem with that gives you at least an art discussion of what the function of poetry is doing, what's its end, what's it trying to do. It's a mode of inquiry. And if you take that, if you actually grant that, then it actually gives you a way to explain why is the Instagram kind of easily digestible poetry not really poetry? It's because it's not an investigation into life. I think actually that note, actually what Javier brought about kind of a suspicion of hobbyism. Remember, amateur, we use a derogatory nowadays. It originally means one who loves. That's actually the mark of usually of someone who's an expert. It's actually their relationship to love. Right, to the topic, to the thing. And it is actually, Daniel just said, a lot of times, sometimes it's craft-based, like it's just a love of sound, for sound's sake, or the way things flow, how sounds flow for a poet. Or the way pigment, like an artist, really, eventually an artist, I know this is like, people in love with like the smell of the turpentine and the linseed oil. They love the smell of the oil. They love the feel of the pigment on the canvas, and the brush goes. Like that kind of literally intimacy with their medium. That's one direction, but the other direction is actually what they do with the work as inquiry into life, into just the experience of life. Kind of, as you said, kind of escaping the mode of capture, and that's a modernist kind of. That's a reorientation of a modernist point of view, but I think it is useful because it's a sense of like it actually pierces thought. That's my point. It's actually it constantly critiques. It's the biggest critique. Generally, my colleagues and many have come up over time is the lack of thought of students, the lack of thought in the work, and it's what they're getting at is what I think this is kind of a better way to articulate what you're saying is that there's actually a thoughtlessness in the work. There's a kind of imitational repetition as opposed to a deeper penetrative inquiry. They're not seeing the making as a kind of inquiry, which is the exact opposite of kind of, again, the really dumb mode of self-expression. Because self-expression can be critical because there's absolutely nothing to measure or to even have a discernment about. But I do think actually on that note of like expertise and that point, I think the best examples of it when a person who's in love and that deep passion, best teachers are that kind of person. So I usually found that as a correlation. Usually the best teachers, it's not their domain expertise per se that makes them great teachers. That has to be there, but it's not necessarily the only case. It's a real love for that topic, both in the way they talk about it, and usually it's a kind of thinking with the content and with the students. So actually a great example of that is when you do a deep read on a piece of literature or whatever, and the instructor, the teacher is with you doing it. I actually do that commonly in my classes when I teach. So if there's an assignment, I'll do it too. So actually that kind of activity with the person, with the class, creates a very different dynamic than me just lecturing afar. That they do the thing and that's it. And then I'm just speaking afar about it. It gives more authority. It gives us different kind, completely different dynamic of the relation of the course experience when that happens. And even as an example, you can do it in philosophy courses. Actually, how we did it. So, like, for example, we read Thomas Aquinas together. That's an example of it. I mean, just like, I didn't give you the readings and just said, that's cool, bro. You come back with questions and I'll answer them. No, I read them with you. And I read them before. So I read them again. And as we commented, there was things I didn't see, as Daniel noted, there was things I didn't see or didn't recognize as much before that my rereading revealed, let alone the discourse talking with you from the readings. So that's the thing that from a pedagogical point of view, that's a very different approach. So in poetry, and by the way, one last note on that. So, and at least the kind of nature of techne, right? It's really interesting because generally Aristotle uses a term his term for poetry can be translated also as production. And that's used for the techne is. Techne is production with truth. The lack of techne is production, poetry with falsity. I just think that's interesting. That's just an interesting detail because it just gives a very, I think for me was very particular about that is one is this idea of what Daniel brought up as a kind of love of the craft, love of the material and the arrangements and the patterns. That's a kind of, what I'm getting at here is that's where I got my kind of intuition to reread Aristotle quickly on what poetry is. Because if it's the not just imitation of life, it's imitation of life that's true. That's also, by the way, like the big transformation, the reveal of how Aristotle's kind of poetry applies, how he's thinking about it. It's because it has contact to truth, right? So it's an imitation of life, which is true to life. And that's what gives it its power. That's the best art does. It has a contact to life, usually through a mode of kind of immediacy of contact acting upon a subject experiencing it. It tends to be the case. This is also why poetry, like for example, comedy sucks. If you have to explain the joke, if you have to explain a joke, it breaks because now the immediacy of the contact of experience has been obliterated because now you're talking about it. This kind of distancing occurs. Which is different versus there's a slight difference when you have to explain the joke versus you have to that's actually why recently I saw the new Snow White. It's terrible as predicted, but I got curious and I rewatched the original Snow White, and then I Tantra was very important, and then the discourse about it. So I think discourse is actually very important about the arts because it's kind of as a love song. It's I want to understand this better because I find this beauty. I find something very powerful in it that I can't articulate 100%. And the inquiry now is to try to understand what was that thing that's so beautiful or powerful in the first place, which is different applicating to explain it versus I don't know the right word to explain it. It's almost I can't find the right word about it. I'm seeing context. I don't know the right word about it. I'm really blanking what would be the best term for it. I open to the floor to think of that, give me an answer on that. Because there is a difference here, right? Versus, I think because obviously it's a discussion where the discussion's happening, right? There's a difference between when the experience has occurred and you've embraced it and you had it and you're in love with it and now you want to know more about it, which is actually very similar to personal relationships, no? In the sense when you fall in love with someone and you want to know more and more about them because the strike has already happened versus prior to the strike, right? So I'm not chewing on that. But I think deeply down in the insides is kind of inquiry into life. And when great writing is occurring, poetry, philosophical texts, making of the arts, this is all inquiry into life, which is the great mystery. And that's what I was getting at with kind of the thought, life, beauty, these things we say, of course we know. And then you actually ask the question, well, what is it? For example, you go, oh, right, actually, I don't know. Or it's better said, it's way more complex of a dimension than we actually thought. I think those are really important details. And I'm going to stop with that.
Magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. And what you were saying on the discourse, there's some art thinker who talks about like art creates a certain conversation and culture around it. And if something doesn't create an art and conversation around it, it's not art. It might be nice, it might be lovely, it might be entertainment, but it's not art. So there's also something to be said about a poem has to be able to generate a discourse and it like conversations about like you could talk about Paradise Lost. Well, people have been talking about Paradise Lost for hundreds of years continually over and over again and going back to it and getting new things. Pretty freaking remarkable. Whereas many of the perhaps more Instagram poems, not that I'm trying to make a cheap hit, but there is a difference. It is hard to imagine that one would be talking about any of these poems for hundreds of years. And you can say, well, they're short. Yeah, Milton wrote short poems too. We don't talk about those as much. You can say, like, it's not because it is short, because there are shorter works that people talk about, some of Shakespeare's sonnets or different things like that. I don't think Tennyson's To Seek, to Find, and Not to Yield, Ulysses, that's not long. Second Coming is not long, so it's not necessarily length, but you can read Yeats or, No Country for Old Men or things like that, and they just go on and on and on and on. And the conversation continues to go forever. Yeah, Dickens, that's another great one. Tell It Slant, right? Oh my gosh, you go back for that forever. But the point is that there's something about, can the work sustain discourse continually and for an extended period of time? And if not, then there's something problematic there. If it is a poem, it is perhaps not a good poem. I think also what you're saying about citation, there is definitely I think basically there's a difference between putting yourself under authorities and great thinkers for training and mentorship versus putting yourself under an authority so you can hide behind them. Also, there's a big difference between saying, I'm going to be an Aristotle scholar so I can be a specialist and have status. And actually, I'll be a specialist so I don't have to read anything else. I can just read Aristotle, and there's a certain concealing and enclosure that occurs, right? As opposed to, I'm going to put myself under the masters, not to hide from everyone, but actually because I need that training for life. And it's encouraged. Like, is the relationship to authority and citation one of courage? Many people cite to fit into the consensus. They cite in order to get the approval of what other people think. Like, if you want approval from the Aristotelian community, one doesn't talk about lack. You talk about all the stuff that all of the Aristotelian scholars talk about. If you do that, you start, other Aristotle scholars might get mad at you because he saw something we didn't see. Grr, we got to go after that guy. Like status and pride come up and different things like that, right? So often, I guess what I have in mind is what you can see in the culture of using authority. There's a use of, I'm going to tell you what Aristotle really thought, versus there's this thing in Aristotle we haven't thought, and there are real effing stakes for not thinking this. And here it is in Aristotle. Aristotle provides a really important framing that we need to really think, and actually we can understand a lot more of what Aristotle is saying if we take this seriously. Oh, and because we didn't, we are facing real consequences. I think that is also another key notion, is like, when I read something and I go, this is good, I suppose, there's a sense of stakes. Like when you read poetry, you feel the stakes. Like, you feel the stakes in The Wasteland, in my opinion, when you read it. You feel the stakes. Like, there are stakes here. T.S. Eliot is writing, and there are stakes because the world is in trouble, right? When you read a lot of the, say, Instagram poetry, you don't have a feeling of the stakes. So when you read a lot of the academic publications, it doesn't feel like stakes. It feels like I'm showing you my status, or I'm giving you the true reading. Okay, but what are the stakes of this true reading of this thinker? What is it that we need from this quote-unquote true or informed reading, without which we're in trouble, right? That's usually not there. And that's usually why most academic papers, honestly, are simply in the academic debate, because you can make a career out of that. Honestly, many thinkers, like what you're doing with Aristotle, or, my beloved David Hume, because I think David Hume is radically misread. For me, that work on Hume is because I think there are radical stakes for not understanding what Hume said. And that in missing, that's been bad. That's been really bad. But then there's also another idea where when I read Hume, it's also I'm going to cite Hume because he had the idea first. I'm not going to see this thing that was missed in Hume and then take it as my own idea and be like, this is important. This is what I said. It's like, he said it. He gets the credit. And also, it elucidates an entire project. And also, if you take it back to Hume, you can understand the rest of the treatise of human nature. Oh, and this is why we can also fit the Scottish Enlightenment with parts of the German idealist class, right? There's a line of thought that, oh, now we can actually understand what the German idealist class is talking about. And this leads us into what I like to talk about, the modern counter-enlightenment, right? So there's also a big difference for me behind processes of putting yourself under authority for training and recovery and courage, where much of the citation and academic culture can actually be hiding or a specialization so I don't have to read other books, and that I can just entertain a single discourse. The discourse of Hegel scholars, the discourse of Aristotle scholars, the discourse of these people, right? Hiding in a discourse, as Mr. Flores was mentioning the other day. That's also a different relationship between authority and citation on the certain shielding that people are engaging in that also is very, very problematic. There's much more to say, but I'll give it to Michael and Javier. I will say on this idea of removing the form and it's kind of unleashed the apocalypse, it makes me think... because I really love this part in A Man for All Seasons with Thomas More. And, they're about to put him in prison for this crime. And they're like, you should just run. He's like, no, I'm not going to run. I'm going to follow the law. And he's like, well, the law is dumb. You shouldn't follow it. And he says something like, oh, yes, tear down every single law, go through the forest and cut down all the trees so that you can run free. But then when the mighty gales of Satan blow and you have nothing to hide behind, where will you go then? When you find yourself defenseless in that forest because there are no trees behind which to hide. I follow the law for my own safety's sake. There's a way in which form, once we removed it, we cut down all the trees, and now we're defenseless to all of these forces that are making us incapable to know what art is, mediocrity, and all these things. And it turned out that form was actually a certain protection of the craft that then when you cut it down, because basically Thomas More is like, I'm going to follow the law even if it's unjust. Because if we remove the law, then it will be anarchy and destruction and we're doomed. Then Satan will really have his say with us, is what he's saying. So likewise, if you remove form and the oppressions of form, well, then you might be defenseless to the mighty gales of chaos that come raining in. At the same time, if you don't take that risk, there are other consequences of that, right? But what we're finding is, basically what has to happen is if you remove forms and don't replace it with a new form, perhaps a form of apprehension or a form that is in the text itself, not simply in its parameters, which might be a return to something Platonic, I suppose, then you're going to be at the mercy of these raging gales. And that's, I think, the responsibility of the poet now. But let me give it to Michael. Michael, please.
Oh my gosh, I feel like I've never been as excited to speak at the net as I am right now because there's just so much good stuff. I fear too many things to boil down into one, so I'll kind of just try and focus in on what I feel like are the juiciest points. So I started taking poetry more seriously, I don't know, say 3-4 months ago. And I was writing a lot and I wasn't really holding myself to any constraints. I was just like, if a rhyme came, great, but like I wasn't holding myself to that. And I realized like I had this moment where it occurred to me that I was like, why do I write poetry and not a short story? And I was like, it's because I don't have to write as much, basically. It's like I realized I was just like lazily kind of copping out. And so now I'm in this poetics class where we're reading, I mean, like the best of the best poetry and literature, but more of a focus on poetry. And we're learning meter and iambic pentameter. It's not like a how to write poetry class. It's more of a survey and kind of a deep, close reading of lots of different poetry. And so I realized that, and this is like been said a million times, but like constraints create beauty, like constraints create beautiful art. And so I am holding myself now to, not just rhyming, but writing iambic pentameter and trying to write either AABB or AB rhyme schemes, and holding myself to like 4-line stanzas, and like employing all of these instruments. And I'm sure there's and then trying like alliteration and enjambment and things like that. And it's harder, but like it's so much more rewarding to finish a poem and have gone through the struggle of, okay, I can't just like sit down and just write what I want to write about. Like I can use the impulse to create the beautiful sunrise or idea or concept, and like bring that to the page. But like in the same sense that, no disrespect to Jackson Pollock, but if you want to create a great painting, you can't just splatter paint on the canvas. Like you have to work within the constraints of lines and texture and shape and lighting and all these things. And so there's that. And so now I want to kind of talk about like the free verse versus like how did we get there? What are the consequences of free verse? Just a simple Google AI generated search confirmed what you mentioned, Daniel, about the history of free verse being kind of a 20th century invention. And I think about like the beat poets like Ginsberg, Kerouac being, starting with Whitman, but like I think really becoming really becoming like part of the zeitgeist in that era. And that was this, it was during the 60s, this great era of deconstruction, really. And so I think like it really got swept up in the moment of like kind of just this self-expression, like kind of emphasis on just kind of seizing the impulse to create and just kind of expressing oneself. And what I was really excited to talk about, just in general, but now grounded in this poetry idea, is you mentioned last week on the net something about how we experience ourselves much more in time than in space. And I thought that was so interesting. And if I think about Rupi Kaur, or actually Javier and I had a little Instagram voice message conversation about Rupi Kaur, someone like Rupi Kaur, or like Instagram poetry, and so much of like the therapeutic age we live in, it's all about exploring space. If you think about people talking about like becoming aware of your body in space, becoming aware of where your self boundaries are, where someone else begins, it's like it's all about space. And I think that's beautiful, and I think that's like needed. But in the kind of post-modern whatever age where we've divorced ourselves from history, where we've kind of like demonized history, and we're hyper focused on space. Like you think about safe spaces, like we're like so obsessed with space, and we've kind of just become these like floating like nebulous blobs that like don't have attachment to chronology and history and tradition. And Thomas was talking about the love of history, and I think the free verse Instagram poetry is kind of a symptom of divorcing poetry from all of these instruments of poetry, all of the tools of poetry. And I've also, in my own poetry, as nauseating as it might be to people who read it and me, like I've included a lot of like biblical references and like biblical direct quotes in my poetry. And I don't even like, it's like, yeah, I'm like called to do that and I see the beauty of it, but it's also another kind of constraint for me. Like it's like I don't want this poem to just be this like self-contained thing. Like I want it to feel like it has some ground in things that people have thought about for 2000 years. And again, is a thin line between just depending on that and then just kind of regurgitating that as opposed to using it to I really see it as like a way to ground my ideas in something like legitimate as opposed to just like it's like a way for me to check my own bullshit kind of thing. And I think, you know, like I read like Milton Sampson Agonistes for this class, and it's like fucking like 2000 lines. It's like this giant poem. We didn't even read all of it because it was so long. But if you read, there's a version online, and it has all these citations of like, here's the reference, the direct reference in the Bible of this, or here's like something in Paradise Lost that he's bringing back. And so, you know, even the discussion about citations, you wouldn't think poetry is an art that relies on citations the same way philosophy does, but like the greatest poems and poets do. Like, you know, if you read Dickinson, it's like saturated with biblical, and she even had this really complex relationship with Christianity and institutional Christianity in particular. But like, you know, Wordsworth, Coleridge, like they all like recognized the beauty, the metaphorical importance, the cultural and social like importance of and it's so bound. Like you read those poets and you just really feel like, oh, they're grounded in the era that they're talking about. Like they, you know, Tintern Abbey written the day before Bastille Day, and it's kind of this like poem where, you know, like it's a reflection on like a lost faith. I haven't read all of it, but you know, people who like Wordsworth scholars talk about that. And so it's like it's grounded in the era that it's you know, it's being written in, but it also, I think, crucially understands how history repeats itself, and so it refers to the past as well as being grounded in the present. That's all.
Wonderful. Well, you said a lot that's very important. I'll give it to Javier and Christian. Then if anyone has anything else to say, I really appreciate this topic. So all things that are, say, good or right are perverted under the wrong spirit. So what I mean by that is there's a form of citation that is participation in the great conversation, and then there's a form of citation that is I have more authority than you and I can play more chips on the table. I like Hermann Hesse's the idea of the glass bead game. Oh, I can make more citations than you. I won the game, right? So you're gamifying citations, right? Or you're using authority to shut down or to create status, right? But then there's also a certain authority that comes from the skill, like the authority a great jazz musician has that's tied to a skill, not a status, right? So there's the authority of skill and there's the authority of status, right? So part of the issue now is basically because today we don't believe in the great conversation, then basically there are only interests. Oh, you're interested in philosophy. You're interested in Aristotle. You're interested in things. Oh, you have authority because you're a specialist in Aristotle. So it's tied to a certain authority that is, oh, they have authority in this hobby. So if you go into that hobby, what they say goes, right? And it almost has a certain totalitarian feel to it, right? And if you don't have a PhD, you should best just shut up because there's, you know, you haven't met the specifications to participate, to be part of it, right? Whereas authority, if you believe in a great conversation, it's more like authority is great conversation skill. Meaning if you find yourself in the great conversation, oh, it's here, it's going on, okay, let's go. There's a certain skillfulness that you need and a certain, I've read those things, okay, I can follow that thought. because you know how Jesus says the wind comes and goes and you don't know where it's going to be? The great conversation is kind of like that. You never know who you're going to bump into, where the great conversation will pop up. And now we're talking about the great debate between Plato and Aristotle that's been going through history for thousands of years. And here it is. You know, do you have the great conversation is a stage. It's more like a stage on which you go to perform, and there's a certain skill to it, right? That's how, in my opinion, it is supposed to be. And the great conversation, therefore, must be kept alive. You can't perform unless the stage is there. And so when you see these illusions in Eliot, or these illusions, it's just like it's bringing the stage for the performance, right? It is bringing the tradition there so that you know, hey, this poem is actually in the great conversation, and it is unfolding of that. It's not just a personal expression. Like, the great conversation is here, right? Like, and when I talk about, like, many people, when you talk about the great conversation, they see it as this sort of tyrannical canon that is telling you who's great and who's bad, who's in and who's out. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. It's more like a spirit that comes and goes, and it shows up. And many people, or anyone, is actually part of it who has the skill to be part of it. One would not say that only Miles Davis can do Round Midnight. Anyone who has the skill can do Round Midnight. But there is, in fact, a certain skill required in order to play upon that stage, right? So the great conversation has a certain coming and goingness to it, right? And so authority is tied to the skill of being able to participate in when it shows up, when there's a certain surprise that occurs, right? And I think when you think about it that way, then citations and referring to authorities are simply the bringing forth where the conversation has been, because you can't continue a conversation if you forget where it's been, right? If the great conversation is a continuation through the ages, then you need to cite as an act of remembering. That's a difference. There's citation as an act of remembering, and there's a citation as an act of building you know, kind of artillery shells almost, right? And so, you know, there are difference between those things, right? But to make sure the conversation is up to speed, one of the reasons you're reading old books or you're citing different things are acts of remembering or locating where the conversation is at to properly contribute to it. Like, it's like realizing what part in the performance you are at. What note are we on the third movement or second movement of Beethoven? Oh, we're on the third. Well, then don't play the second. You need to have read to know where it's at, right? But if you can't recognize the second, you might not know that it's the third, right? So you need to know all of these different informations to know where it's going. But I don't think it's by chance, and then I'll give it Javier and Christian. I don't think it's by chance where we basically have deconstructed notions of a great conversation or a canon or some sort of continuation that now we don't even know what we're doing when we're reading old books. That's kind of the irony. Deconstruction actually made way for almost a worse tyranny in the form of specialized authority. It's supposed to kind of tear down certain power structures. Mr. Jockin, good to see you. It's supposed to tear down power structures, but kind of like what Jesus said, you remove a demon and don't put a good thing in its place, you get 7 more. You actually got to, in my opinion, yeah, you don't have this massive dictator, but you get a bunch of these mini dictators in all these specialization fields, almost petty bourgeoisie kind of things, like Marx talks about. You get these petty kind of dictator forces in all these different fields that is very, very problematic. And so basically, because we don't have a framework of some sort of great conversation that's continuing, then there's a perversion of all these things like citations, and we don't know what they are. We don't know what authorities are. Like, I think what you're saying, you have no sense in much of the Instagram poetry, not to be mean. You have no sense that they feel like they need to read the great poets. There's no sense of a need that I need to go read literature. There's no sense of I'm missing out on something by not knowing that stuff, right? That is very telling, because it means it doesn't believe in a great conversation. And then if you ask, well, what is the great conversation? It's us. It's humanity. It's us trying to unfold into the history in a non-reductionist, empirical, just mere facts. We're trying to actually be something more than just material composition that's trying to think that of which is not given in immediacy and nevertheless is part of immediacy. The great conversation is us. So if you don't believe in that or feel like you're missing something, then actually art is just setting us up for the AI apocalypse, because we don't have any humanity that is distinct. We have no continuation. So why should we continue? I need Christian, what he was saying about experience, it still needs to, that was very important. There is more to be said. I think I would also say, like, sometimes instead of asking what is poetry or what is art, there's kind of an asking of what is the poetry needed? What is the art needed? What is that of which will break something apart, that will make people see something that otherwise they wouldn't see? I think there are different questions, because if you go, oh, is this poetry or not? Well, who cares if we don't need it? Like, who cares if it doesn't, like, open up the subject? Who cares if it doesn't help us have a strike of beauty? Who cares if it doesn't condition us for something more, right? Sometimes questions of isness get in the way of questions of what is fitting. And I think basically, too, isness can, well, you don't have to ask questions of, am I writing to that higher occasion? You simply write something and then defend if it's poetry or not. You're done, right? But if instead there's a question of what needs to be written for a time such as this, then you can look at your poem and say, yes or no, it is part of the effort of what is needed for a time with this. You can be judged then. You can fail. Oh, let's go back to just arguing if it's poetry or not, which I know I'll be able to defend because no one can say for sure what is poetry. Therefore, I'm safe. In that ambiguity, I can't be judged, and I can't fail, right? But arguably, when you can't fail, then you've already failed if there is indeed a great conversation and real stakes. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
No, this is great. I mean, I like what Michael's saying, because, like, you know, if you ever tried writing a sonnet, then you understand, like, I mean, it only takes you one time. And I actually have, like, one on my Substack where I wrote one, and I remember I showed it to Sam Green. And so it still cracked me up. She was so good about it, so nice about it. She's like, well, it's not your best work. But, you know, I had the same satisfaction that Michael is having about, well, I worked so damn hard to construct the syllables, and I still suck at stressed and unstressed kind of framing, because, like, that's the musicality of the English language, like the fact that it works in stressed and unstressed form. That's really the musicality of the English language. And, well, but the thing is, you wouldn't understand that historically. Like, you wouldn't understand that if you didn't encounter history about, like, you know, like, this is what poets are thinking about when they're constructing their forms. It's very purposeful and it's very crafted. Now, when we talk about free verse, I think it's a huge mistake to say it's not a constraint. That's where you fall into the oblivion of precisely the fact that it is the most daunting constraint. Because to me, it already shows you what we think about freedom. When they say free verse is not a constraint, really, it's not a constraint. It doesn't get to the point where you don't question whether it's a poem or not. Because to me, that is the constraint. That the constraint says to you, now do what you want with your freedom. And it's terrifying. But the thing is, for me, I've been writing free verse for a couple of years now, but I always stayed within the Rupi Kaur kind of realm. And then I dropped it, and then, like, now I'm picking it up again, but seriously, and I'm realizing for the first time that free verse is actually very daunting. Like, to me, it's actually horrifying, because I don't know what I'm doing. I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no idea what I'm doing with my freedom when I'm writing free verse. And to me, only then do you get a glimpse of understanding, like, that freedom is a constraint, and that you want to go back to syllables and stress and unstress, because at the very least, for goodness sake, at the very least, like, they point you into a direction, right? Like, okay, well, you know, at least it's a bad poem, but then you get to free verse and you go, well, is this even it? Is this even a poem? But you can only understand the brutality of that by looking at the history of forms. You can only understand that actually when you try to write a sonnet and it's still crap, that Shakespeare is a fucking genius. Like, oh my God, he's a genius. And that's how I know, like I don't deserve the right to be called a poet. But I'm also not interested in sonnets. But also at the same time, I respect the craft. Like it's so darn good the way Shakespeare does it. Um, so it's about how do we teach people to respect the craft? Because free verse, it's to me, it's the Heideggerian irony of just like, okay, so now you've unfolded this thing. Okay, well, the thing about history is that all of a sudden it covers over itself. Truth covers over itself again. And then so now we are into this dilemma where free verse is all just shit poetry because nobody respects the history in which things are crafted. And it's not really their fault. It's just the product of our thrownness. But how do we get to the point where we realize our thrownness to understand that actually poetry has its history of its own craft, and to understand that free verse was necessary in order to encounter the abysmal notion of freedom, in which it's terrifying, in which perhaps not all of us, can handle that abysmal like thing. Because for me, it's like deeply existential. Like, I mean, yeah, it's so yeah, it's so frustrating actually. To me, like free verse is the most frustrating thing to do because it's like, all right, go ahead, speak poetry. Like there's no nothing, there's no constraint, there's nothing. And like people think that's freeing. I think that's so daunting. Because but then it's so symptomatic of like, okay, so this is actually terrifying. Like, but the thing is, people need to realize it's terrifying. They don't understand that it's terrifying. That's the horrible part, is that they don't understand that free verse is terrifying. And that it actually puts into question whether you're a poet, whether you're writing poetry, whether you're doing anything at all. Are you just expressing thoughts? I mean, the fact that you can even be reduced to that is interesting. Like you're just expressing thoughts. Um, and the hopefully we don't have the reflex to defend, like, yeah, maybe I am just expressing thoughts, like maybe it is just expressing thoughts. But I want to touch on this note of history a little bit more. I don't know if you guys seen that movie Mickey 17. um I suggest you guys watch it. It's super good. um Mainly because well, actually, I guess they don't bring it up in the novel. I don't know if they bring it up in the movie, but it's a novel. My girlfriend read it. She said she really loved it. We also watched the movie. Um, she says that in Mickey 17, they start cloning people, right? And in order to go to space, like the guy doesn't have enough money, so he decides to opt for this program to clone himself and basically die as a part of his job. So he's like the test guinea pig to die for all the things that they want to explore in space and stuff. But what's very interesting about it is the reason why he decided to do that is because they said history is no longer a viable profession, that people can just look it up. And I was like, wow, that's a mistake. I was like, that's a mistake. That's a huge mistake. So you don't need historians anymore because you can just look things up, and that just solves it for you. And I found that so symptomatic of just like that history became so nonchalant. I mean, just so like trivial, of just like, well, we can look it up. It's not a big deal. We don't need a historian to give us any theoretical imposition about how to even possibly interpret history or the way to possibly look at it. It was just, oh, we can look it up. So it just shows me that in this movie, history just becomes a source of data versus a source of like actual like existential interpretation of how we could look at things, or how we could look at things in a different way, like possibilities, like Heidegger, versus like it's just data. We don't need historians, so you're going to be our guinea pig now. And that was kind of terrifying to me. Of just like in the movie, it was just like, well, that does sound like a possibility. That does sound like history could be reduced to just data and points, and we no longer take history seriously. So I think there's some interesting bridge about this idea of free verse, freedom, history being reduced to just data, um, And then the last thing is, even though we talk about the beautiful a lot, I wrote a poem recently. It's called about the courage to face the ugly. And I mean, it's, you know, I struggle with whether I consider it a good poem in itself or whatever. But the main point that I was trying to make was that we have this aesthetic fetishism, but the beautiful is deeply tied to the ugly. That was the main argument of my poem, which is the ugly is very close to the beautiful, because what it takes is that actually it takes courage to face the ugly in order to even give an opening to encounter the beautiful, versus aesthetic fetishism just wants everything to be pleasant, and they mistake the beautiful. But actually, the ugly is where you encounter the terrifying part about beauty. You know, I have this part, like, you know, I have this part. It's a very ugly part. I make it ugly on purpose. I have this ugly part where it's like you can't even stare at yourself in the mirror, belly out, cock in your hands. You know, like it's just like you can't stare at yourself because you're disgusted about how you look, about ugly things that you've done. And when we can't even have the courage to face these things, well, does that that kind of eliminates beauty as a possibility. So for me, I was thinking about how the ugly can be an avenue to let beauty come out, is just because I think there is a confusion between collapsing beauty and aesthetic pleasure as merely aesthetic pleasure, and then ugliness gets like this like very weird place in society where it's like ugly is just ugly. You know, ugly is just our no, like there's something very existential about ugliness. You know, like when Nietzsche says like Socrates was ugly. That's like such a wonderful jab that I still think about. Like Nietzsche was like, yeah, Socrates is ugly. Like his face was ugly. You know, like I love that. Because it says something so much, and I want more exploration on the philosophy of ugly, of what that does for us in society.
Wonderful. I love that quote as well, and what you're saying on ugly. I think that's very, very important. And one could almost wonder, you know, as almost a certain thesis, is there something about the likelihood of losing the beautiful or its conflation with mere aesthetic pleasure, or the term that you were using, when you have no sense of the great conversation? Like, is there something about the great conversation? Because, of course, there's always, you know, you're talking about ugly. There's something about the ugly tied to the beautiful. There's also something about violence. And it's very interesting that many of the great books somehow merge violence and beauty. Obviously, The Anger of Achilles, but Cormac McCarthy. Like, people speak about the extraordinary violence of McCarthy somehow having a beauty to it, right? Like, there's something where perhaps the mistake of separating beauty from ugly and violence is a more likely mistake if you lose track of the great conversation, because it falls into personal experience. And it is very difficult to personally experience ugliness as beautiful at the same time. But when it is in the world or in great literature, you can more easily have that experience. And then from that external experience of the ugly being beautiful, perhaps learn how to see your own ugliness as beautiful. But I think it's very difficult to start there. And therefore, if you only stay in personal expression, you never get there, right? Whereas when you read, say, Achilles, and you see, wow, there's something that can actually be poetic about violence, or even beautiful, maybe violence in my own life can have some sort of beauty to it. But if you only stay in personal expression, I don't think you think that thought, because it just never feels true, dang it. It doesn't feel true. And so if your basis of deciding what is true is practically what you feel, you would never get to that. And that would perhaps reduce the probability of the experiences of beauty. I'll give it to Christian. If you still want to speak, please.
I'll say a little bit.
Please.
Those are great comments, Javier. I feel like I see two things happening increasingly. One is the the kind of pleasantry that you're talking about. And I've become a little bit of a Substack user in that, like, I scroll right through the notes feed and stuff like that. I cut out a lot of, I don't use Instagram anymore. I really only use Twitter for work these days. But I'm like, just vibing on Substack and trying to not let it take too much of my time. But I get like a little bit of a sickly feeling when I see these like aesthetic posts, which are, look at this unattainable vintage whatever sofa and stuff like this, where it is aesthetically pleasing, and I do appreciate the beauty of it. But it's like, what is this? I feel like it's just I don't know. It's not. It doesn't feel healthy, I guess, or something. Like or it's like it's not a holistic. It's not holistically healthy. And there's something there that I appreciate, and then there's something that's like, ugh. And it also feels like an escapism to me, where we're just distracting ourselves from ugliness, and maybe there's even something there about like. This is, kind of whatever, amateur social commentary, but the the seeming ignorance of the whatever, the economic, the implicit economic beliefs there when I see these posts about aesthetic, whatever, So I saw one the other day that was like the retired grandma working in her garden vibe is ageless or something like this. And it's like, okay, yeah, this like, and there's like a post of like some grandmas working, and it's like, these are like wealthy people in these massive, beautiful gardens. And it's like, I don't know. I just, I'm not like a huge social justice warrior or something like that, but I'm like, this is like garish to me. Like, why are we fetishizing like this like affluent thing as like, I don't know, there's a false modesty to it, where like, I'm just a grandma, blah 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 blah, and this is just like vintage, it's classic or something. It's like, no, this is bullshit. Anyway, on the other hand, there's like another thing, which is more fetishizing the whatever, like classicalism or something like this, which is like, oh, the statue of David. Now this is actual beauty, compared to like the banana taped to the wall and stuff like that, which I also see as a little bit problematic, because it's I don't know. I guess maybe this is like a meta modern argument or something, but it's like we're I don't know, regressing a little bit to let's take away the critical self-reflection, or like meta reflection on the conversation about art or something. I just, yeah, of course David is a fucking beautiful statue, but I almost see the same problem with that as I see with like the grandma, which is like, okay, so what? Like, this person was funded by patrons who gave them the money that they could spend hours of time chiseling every fucking vein in David's hand or something. And yes, that there's technical merit there, but like, is that the peak of beauty? I mean, what about like a bloody baby coming out of a woman? Like there's so much more to beauty than just technical precision and like exquisite rendering or something like this. But I feel like we're in this place where we're we're in the madness of the meaning crisis, blah blah blah, and searching desperately for something that seems reliable, and you can make an argument for it, or you can make a vibe toward it. Like, I either have this very detailed philosophical argument about the Statue of David, or I just have this kind of like thoughtless, unquestioning vibe about grandma. Like, isn't grandma ageless? Let's not talk about it. But like, Yeah, vibey, or arguey. And both of these seem like fraught things to me in the question of like how do we reground ourselves in our sense of beauty? Um, and I think the concept of ugliness that Javier brought up is a helpful one here because ugliness challenges both of those things, right? It's like I'm just like going back to high school and the piss Christ and stuff like that. Uh, and then that Catholic nun, what was her name? Who like there was that old like 80s or 70s, maybe it was PBS series or something, BBC, of like this Catholic nun with this funny lisp, and she would like go talk about art and stuff. And she was like a defender of the piss Christ, which is that old piece of like a crucifix in a jar of piss. And I always loved that this like old like quirky Catholic nun defended the piss Christ. but the ugliness to me, it's important. It's like there's that word grotesque, right? Which seems to want to like combine our notions of beauty with our notion of ugliness. And grotesquerie, I think, is an interesting site of beauty. And in general, if you want to like do a transcendental framing, let's say that like faith is this acceptance that everything is good at the baseline, right? Well, then I would say that means everything is beautiful, and then everything we encounter, which we want to like move out of the boundary of the beautiful, is really just a challenge, right? That's like a challenge which we may or may not pick up in any given moment, and sometimes extremely difficult work. Like, I mean, you're not going to go around telling someone who's suffered deep abuse or something like, you need to just see the beauty in that. Like, they might want to take up that work, but like, it's not like something you just prescribe willy-nilly. It's like I don't know, we all have our work for ourselves to like find the beauty and the goodness and all of the dirt and the pain and all of that. But I think it's always there to be. That's my view on it. Is like the ugliness is work which we may or may not take up in our lives, but if you can see it that way, you also afford yourself some inner peace, right? Like for me at least, it's like I'm not going to try to see how that's beautiful right now, but I have this deeper peace knowing that at the end of the day, it's all beautiful. And I'm where I'm at in finding and seeing that beauty. I had some other stuff. It's getting late. I want to give Michael time to talk, so I'll keep it there.
Magnificent. And what you said about there being a problem between like David and the grammar, that's exactly right. You know, Scruton talked about Kiss, but there's also this thoughtlessness. Because that's great art and I don't have to think about it, right? That's part of the problem. Both of them have this certain removal of you, which there's this weird way in which you remove you from the process of determining. You actually become almost like a god. You actually gain power in that. It seems humble, actually, because you're saying that's great art and I'm just a humble person. But you have the ultimate taste. You have the ultimate judgment, right? So it's actually a power move. And so likewise, when you say, look at that grandma, isn't he great? It means I'm able to judge what really matters in life. I really know I'm not chasing fame. I'm not teaching these things. I know the right vibe. I know what's right. It's a power move. So both of these are power moves. And unfortunately, much of art has been used in service of power and therefore been hollowed of itself. Because I do think and there are things to be said about what Javier was saying on free verse that are very important, but I think the correct understanding of great works of art is more of a sense of there is something going on I need to get in on. Oh, there's this thing occurring. There is this possibility of human beings. There is some story. I need to get in on that. And art is like, oh, and by the way, you can't get in on that unless you think. You have to put yourself in it and be courageous and throw yourself into the risk. And that's also why the hideous and you have to get in the grotesque. You have to get in the ugly. You have to look everywhere. You have to feel vanity of vanities. You have to get in on it. There's something going on and you need to get in on it. These statues are testaments of this thing going on, this thing unfolding that is human, that is us, and you need to get in on it. And it's a call. Obviously, the famous example is Rilke's "You Must Change Your Life." Like it's piercing you, and beauty is basically you need to get in on this. Are you or are you not? And if you're not, why aren't you? What is your excuse? Like, why aren't you? Right? And it's calling something of you. But when you judge and say that's great art, you don't have to change your life. You have the taste. Other people need to change their life because they don't know that's great art. You don't need to change anything. It's on other people. They need to be more like you. And when art is used to make people more like you, you're not getting in on anything greater than you. You're making yourself what people need to get in on. You are the conversation people need to have. You are the way of life that people need to participate in. And that is using art as an idolatry. Because unfortunately, if you have the wrong, any art can be an idol if you have the wrong relationship to it. And I think what you're speaking to is perhaps that mistake. I will say quickly, what you were saying, Javier, on free verse actually being completely horrifying, that is exactly right. But the key is that you have to feel the horror. Like the whole point of the waste, if I were to say, a huge claim of the wasteland is the horror of there is no form. Oh my God, because he's like, yeah, we've lost the form. Fragments, short against ruin, second coming, all that. We don't have form anymore. Isn't that terrifying? The problem is now people are using free form to escape the horror or not to feel the horror versus to make you confront the horror. Free verse was born from not from I like free verse, but we have no choice almost. Like that's the problem. Like free verse is like I like free verse from a certain preference versus we have no choice now. We must. There is no form. So that sort of there is no choice. What are we gonna effing do? That's the spirit of, say, a wasteland, for example. Well, I guess we have to find tradition. Maybe tradition can do it. Oh crap! How can we? Like, there's a question in Eliot. If you don't have form and you bring back tradition, is it not just fragments? You know, how do we store these fragments against our ruin? Key line. Can we? Can tradition actually do anything without form? It's a key question in Eliot that I think ultimately gets resolved with four quartets. But Eliot is a tremendous case study. But the problem is, but this is why also I don't think it's much, because free verse has ended up like capitalism. Because what ends up happening is when you have the freedom of capitalism, you tend to go in the direction of flattening and personal expression, right? But the terror of freedom is actually what you need in capitalism, and capitalism then gives you a product to avoid that, right? So the terror of free verse, then a technique arose to use free verse to commodify it. So the fates of free verse and the fates of capitalism have gone in a very similar direction because there have been similar responses to the terror of freedom. But you need to face that freedom. The issue is that perhaps what we are seeing now is we need a restoring of the form so that we can move back into the freedom and it terrify us again. Not because the freedom is bad, but because we've lost the terror. So there may be a need for a certain reintroduction of form and going back to the tradition and going back to the greats so that we can face the freedom again and have a way to actually structure it in a manner that is not reducing the freedom, but making the freedom flourish, right? So we have to change our relationship to the free verse, and that has a certain going back. You have to, return to and then return to the place of your beginning so that you know it for the very first time. But that point on free verse is extremely important. There is a terror in the free verse, and the key is much of the birth of free verse is actually tied to a certain sentiment of we have no choice. Whereas today people say, I like it, which right there is a betrayal of what free verse is. Because if you like it, if it's what you like and it expresses yourself, then that is not the right relationship to freedom. You have concretized freedom and reduced it into a quality of your enjoyment, as opposed to being it the terror of your condition that then says to you, you must change your life, and you do, or else the freedom destroys you. And so I think the points you're making are very, very good. There is something to be said on the problem of audience and rewarding as well, but let me give it to Michael, and then if anyone has final thoughts. Michael, please.
You basically stole the words right out of my mouth of what I wanted to say to Javier, because I think he's exactly right. I'm reminded of the Rousseau quote, like freedom is the power to choose your own chains, and that being very applicable to the free verse enterprise. But the very crucial distinction is you have to go into it like with the understanding that it's horrifying. It's actually not liberating. I mean, it is, but like in that is also the horrifying nature of liberation. And I think it seems like yeah, I don't want to keep bashing on Instagram poetry. I feel like we've kind of slam dunked on that enough tonight. But like the I guess, the poems were like, like it's just kind of lacking meat on the bone, substance is, I guess you could say, a certain lack of truly encountering the horror of the freedom. And like, like Javier, I think your free verse poetry is beautiful. And I can kind of feel almost in your writing that there's like you're trying to kind of you're trying to create your own chains. Like you're trying to find the ideas, the meaning, the imagery. You're like kind of grasping, and like when I feel that when I'm writing anything, but especially poetry, like that's when I know that I'm doing something like worthwhile. It's like when I feel like I'm like on the cusp, and I'm continuously kind of like, you know, like on the rock and kind of looking for the next handhold kind of thing. Um, so yeah, I think that's like exactly right, Daniel. And like John Vervaeke talks about horror as like an ungrounding. Like it's when like your kind of ontological framework for navigating the world is kind of like ripped from underneath you, and you're like you're exposed to um and I think that kind of connects to ugliness, because like if we live in this kind of trance of um oversaturation of like aesthetic beauty, say kind of the trope of like someone who has a perfect childhood, and then they go off to college, and then they meet people who are like drug addicts, or just people who come from traumatized households, and they're like, holy shit, and they're just overwhelmed with the ugly, even though I don't think that's ugly, but like the horror of um the pain, the warts, the grotesqueness of life. And it's so true. It's like we can only know beauty through ugliness, but also that's probably not even a complete framing of it, because like in the ugliness is the beauty. It's not like there's ugliness here and there's beauty here and they're like yin and yang kind of thing. It's like they're bound up within each other. And if you're a person of faith, you believe God is in all of creation. And so like it's just kind of fundamental to reality that, you look at something and you see the beauty. The last thing before I pass it back is, so I'm curious then if that's true, if like, there's beauty in all things, and even things that are deemed as ugly, like, should be confronted. It made me think about like how today there's a lot of people who are calling for like seeing the beauty in like, for example, like plus size models, like becoming like, okay, like these are beautiful people too, and they should be on the cover of magazines, and like, like they should be in beauty pageants and things like this. Or, like even just something as simple as like, girls should also be able to have face tattoos and short hair and like whatever, mohawks. Um, when does it go too far? Uh, is like my question. Yeah, I don't really have any clear thoughts on that, but I'm curious what anyone thinks.
Magnificent questions, and I've enjoyed this immensely. Thank everyone for everything that they've said. I think so there's a few things. First off, I think basically on the idea that beauty is found in the ugly or that there's some sort of quality of life gained in the wound is basically, or the phrase that you use that it is all bound up in, quote unquote, it is all bound up in. I believe it's basically impossible to believe that without the great conversation. Like without the great conversation, you're just not going to believe that. Now you may get to it in experience in 60s or 70s as you get older. Experience might afford you that. But the experience of it, because you maybe were not prepared for it, you didn't have the resources by which to think it, it destroyed you and thus just made you withdrawn or melancholic, right? And also, too, perhaps the more advanced the economic order gets, the better it is at making sure that you never have those experiences that it is all bound up in. And so you never learn that. And then maybe perhaps the socioeconomic order keeps you comfortable until it breaks, like perhaps we are seeing now, to allude to everything going on in the world, and then you're not able, you're too fragile, and you can't learn that lesson from it without being destroyed, right? But there's something about the great conversation, which is art and culture, that I think actually can get you to get that it is all bound up in. And I think this also gets to the notion of what Christian was asking on what does it mean to say you have less experience. I suppose the way I would think about it is that without, if you don't have the clear distinction between azure and cerulean and blue, then yes, you see the difference, but it's in the background, like Heidegger's working doorknob. It is there, but it never comes into focus and therefore does not become a quality of your experience or subjectivity. And so if something arises where consciously knowing of that difference really matters, it will not be at hand to use, and therefore whatever occurs where you need that distinction may overwhelm you and destroy you, right? So if you never have the philosophy to understand that beauty can be found in the ugly, or that, death, laying down your life can be a form of resurrection, if that is not something you've thought about, then when you suffer the dying of self, or when you suffer ugly, you will not have the concept of hand to bring forth to experience that as a possible source of beauty, and therefore the ugly may destroy you, or the death of the ego may destroy you, because you've never brought that construct to focus to use it as a tool when you need it. Because, Heidegger's, a tool is not necessarily bad. The problem is when we've never thought beyond the tools immediate to us, therefore our tools are set by the cultural zeitgeist, and we never think them, and we're not able to be flexible with our tools, and then therefore we get in trouble. Pragmatism then comes to serve mere capital utility versus the practices of virtue that Aristotle talks about, that we need to be human, right? So a lot of if you don't have language, if you don't have these ideas, these things you experience them as background. They're going to be phenomenon, but they're not ones that will be drawn into your focus, that therefore can be summoned or called on when it can perhaps be very important. And also, it will not be at hand to think so that you can take a different direction in the course of your life. Because, one's choices are going to be bound to what they can think. And if there are things that they've never thought because of the limits of their language that are the limits of their world, then the number of paths in the world are less. And that could be consequential at certain times. And so I think that's what I would say to the question of what does it mean to say that it's outside of experience. It is therefore experienced as background, like a working doorknob, ergo invisible. It's invisible with the in parentheses. It's there, but not there at the same time. And therefore it cannot be brought into practice, and that can have consequences. And then I think basically if the great conversation increases your capacity of experience, so that not so many things are invisible, that it really matters to have at hand, then the loss of the great conversation means you have less resources to employ to really get that things are bound up, and therefore the possibility of beauty is less, the possibility of not being overwhelmed by that experience is less, and the possibility of things like freedom not overwhelming you with anxiety are less. And so a culture that does not believe anything is lost with the loss of the great conversation, and that there is no need for poetry and art to participate in the great conversation, indeed is going to put a whole lot of things in the background that will become invisible. And that's not a bet I would want to take, because if the more what is in the background is that which will not be at hand, and that could be a problem. But then, of course, if Mr. Jockin has told us correctly that poetry is tied to an investigation of life, then one could say it is tied into an investigation of what is in that background, so that it is not mere background and invisible, but can be foregrounded and therefore can increase capacities of the subject in ways that are perhaps extremely important. I think that's also tied to the respect of the craft. If you don't respect the craft, then you don't think you've lost anything by losing the craft, right? So the craft becomes background, and that becomes a problem, because if the craft actually crafted, and you find yourself in life needing to craft something, you won't have the craft to do the crafting. And if that is freedom, then you won't be able to craft the freedom into something beautiful and wonderful. So your experience to the freedom will either be a cheap return to form to escape its anxiety, or a cheapening it into a commodity form, which is exactly what we've done. Because if you're going to encounter the freedom of free verse, but you have no respect to the craft, well, then you have no, way to craft freedom. And so you either run from it, you cheaply return to form, or you shrink it into a cheapening, like the commodity form. So the loss of craft is also basically the loss of the possibility of crafting freedom. And if you can't craft freedom, then it will be experienced as a void and more like a Lovecraft creature. And that's extremely problematic. I think on your question of the plus model, et cetera, so forth, you can't pour in from the top. And what I mean by that is you can't say to people, you ought to see plus size model or all forms of art or whatever as beautiful. You can't command people to do that. They may say they do, but you can't make them experience it. The only way to change what people experience as beautiful is by introducing them to new art and new ideas and conditioning them. If you want people to see beauty in all body forms or all haircut styles or whatever, then it is incumbent upon you by which to create the conditions where people will actually gain the ability to experience that. You will have to write that story that teaches them that. You will have to make the art that can so condition them. So be it, but make it thus. You simply can't pour it from the top, though, as William Wilson would say. I cannot command you to find beautiful anything, but I can create works or introduce you to the great conversation or open you up to that possibility. And that's a role of art. Art is opening the subject, as we were saying, different forms. If you believe we are in a world where the inability to experience all body types as beautiful is leading to suffering and totalitarianism and is a result of some sort of capturing of the subject, that is a massive problem. If you believe that, then you need to figure out the form of poetry, the craft of poetry, and the technique needed by which a person can actually come to experience that and thus see the beauty of it. You have to figure out some sort of skill. Otherwise, you're using politics. And politics will lead people to saying they see it beautiful, but then it becomes a thought police. It becomes a sort of censorship routine, and people won't actually experience it. But if you actually can change people to see a piss Christ or a banana on a wall is beautiful or anything, if you can actually change that for people, then you have done something indeed. But it will take a whole lot of training and crafting and thinking and work to actually achieve that end. But set yourself to it. Certainly anyone can set themselves to it. Otherwise, it is simply a culture war question, not a challenge of the artist. Because many times when we ask, like you're saying on the Sports Illustrated or whatever plus size model, it becomes a culture war topic as opposed to an artistic challenge. If you frame it as an artistic challenge, you say, okay, what kind of art do we need to make so that people are actually conditioned to experience this as beautiful? Well, then, all right, bring it into the realm of art. Think those questions. Come up with that different work. All culture war topics should actually be challenges of the artist. But if we don't believe in technique, if we don't believe in craft, we only believe in personal expression, then it has to stay in the political. It has to stay in the war, right? That's all we can do. But if one wants to set themselves to that, that becomes a matter of how to create those conditions of experience for people, right? Or so that more people have that experience versus a limited amount. If you think that is needed, then that becomes a certain work. There's a few more things to be said, but I'll give it to Christian here. Christian, please.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, but this kind of harkens back to last conversation and the difference for me in kind of making claims about, in this case, what is beautiful, right? And this whole problem of like identification, how it's just a fraught project, in my opinion. I mean, we in a kind of casual way, of course, we'll like, oh, that's a beautiful painting there, but I think always what we're really saying and what it's important sometimes to take care to say is, or at least to recognize within ourselves, is that it's not that that is or is not beautiful. It doesn't have like beauty atoms floating around in it or something like this. It's the relationship, right? So it is my sense of beauty, and this is why I'm wanting to champion this framing of sense of good, sense of beautiful, sense of true, is because then I think it allows for a better conversation. It's so easy to get stuck in a debate about, is the plus size model beautiful, or is it not? Well, then blah, blah, blah. And we've already started, in my opinion, off on the wrong foot. Whereas if we speak to our sense of beauty and you say, I don't see the beauty in this, and someone else says, I do see the beauty in it, then I think we're in a place to have an interesting conversation. What's the beauty that you see in it? Oh, why don't you see the beauty in it? Or whatever, right? And so I don't know. That's to me the interesting thing. Could culture ever take that turn where we're like there's a revolution in how we talk about the transcendentals? I think there maybe needs to be like really bad, but it's a tough one because we're very addicted to is, right, and there's a fear, because if you're not willing to stake a claim in that territory of what is or is not that, then I think people feel vulnerable. There's a I'll save my thoughts for another conversation, but I think we need to have the courage to take beauty and truth and goodness out of that domain of symbolic identification and into the domain of our senses and our innards relating to the external world, and then having conversations from that point.
I completely agree. And I think I think this was easier under theological conditions where nothing was beautiful, it just pointed to beauty, or it participated in beauty, or in societies of analogy. Because like nothing is beautiful, God is beautiful, but everything can point to God, right? So then some words you would see was sensibility. You could cultivate a sensibility, ergo sense of, right? And basically then this is also tied to, I guess, what I was saying on conditioning, because gaining a sense of beauty requires a cultivation of virtue or a cultivation of certain conditions needed to sense that thing as beauty or get a sense of beauty. But nothing was beautiful. That could be a shorthand to say it is, to me, has the sensibility of beauty, because only God ultimately is beautiful, good, and true. Things can point to God, things can participate in it, but can't be that. What ended up happening is when you lost the theological, but you still wanted to keep the true, the good, and the beautiful, well, that brought it down to the equivocal, per se. That brought it down to the equal, the is. And so then now there's all these different problems, but this idea of talking about the transcendence as senses is a return, in my opinion, to recovering, and is exactly to what you're saying. It's a recovery of an analogous thinking, of it is like the beautiful. It is a sense of the beautiful. It points to the beautiful. Where you don't have that mode, it is absolutely a war. And thus, one can understand postmodernism wanting to deconstruct these things, because they said these just lead to totalitarianism. These just lead to war. Yes, they do. That's why they used to talk as them analogically, as pointing, right? That way you can keep them without these pitfalls, right? But you then had to but then it was tied to how do you cultivate the conditions for people to have experiences of that? Well, those were virtue questions. And that was and then of course, when they used to say the artist is in the role of a certain moral education, we have no idea what that means now. We think, oh, propaganda. No, 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 no. It meant the artist was creating the conditions for you to get a sense of the good, the true, and the beautiful. That's what a moral education was. It wasn't, obviously there are versions of propaganda moral tales or whatever, but a lot of it was more of a, how do we train people to have a sense of the transcendence? Like that's education, a sense of them, and then they can discuss that sense. But we can't think this anymore. Like we're very confused about all of this. Well, honestly, none. It would be very hard to find an Abrahamic tradition or a religious tradition that would have any problem saying at all that a plus-size model could be beautiful. I mean, absolutely she can be beautiful because she could be virtuous and you could be virtuous and you would get a sense of the beautiful, right? Like they would have like the ugly could be beautiful. I mean, Jesus is dying on a cross bloody. They had no problem with these issues because they thought analogously and they thought in terms of things pointing and being beyond yourself. It's us today that are confused about these topics because we don't have the right epistemology or ontology, and then therefore it inevitably ends up in the politics where we're doomed. It's just going to lead to violence. And so what you are saying is extremely important, and I extremely agree. I suppose the final thing I would say on this fine evening, and thank you all for being here till this time, to what Mr. Ebert was saying at the beginning, and I think this is relevant to it on this question of audience. How does one write? Do you write for an audience? Do you not? Do you write your own thoughts, et cetera, so forth? A word that has been used at a point of this is rewarding. And if you use like the idea that I wrote this poem using form and it's rewarding, even if people don't like it, there's a feeling of it being rewarding. And I think when you do something hard or you worked at something hard, there can be a sense that it was rewarding, even if there is no audience. And I think that's the correct way to approach things. But also, there's a sense that it's rewarding because it increases your sense of the beautiful or sense of the good or the true. The reward is increased in that gain capacity. That's a reason why you write. And for me, I judge the quality of the writing on if it has some sort of rewarding sense. And another key characteristic of the rewarding is that I get to talk to you fine people, because this work, this reading actually then creates the ability to have these conversations. If you did not do this work, that maybe nobody reads or nobody clicks on and likes, you would not actually have the sensibility to follow a conversation or to bring something to it or to have it unfold, right? And there is something powerfully rewarding about that experience of being with people such as y'all. And that becomes a proper, in my opinion, metric of if the writing or the reading is being done in the right way. Does it open possibilities and ways of being and sensibilities that before the work were not possible? And if the answer is yes, then one should continue to do it in the way that they are doing it. And if the answer is no, then one should change. But what you should change for is not for more clicks, but for more sensibilities, more participations, and more rewarding conversations such as this. Thank you for being here this evening. It's been a treat. Best to you all.
Take care, Daniel.